What if Luffy was the reincarnation of Rox D. Xebec? Okay, hear me out, this is absolutely insane. Rox wasn't just any pirate, this dude had Big Mom, Kaido, and Whitebeard on his crew when they were nobodies. His conqueror's haki was so broken they called it the crown of tyranny. Imagine that level of power suddenly awakening in our rubber boy's mind through dreams and memories. But here's the twist that makes this concept pure gold. What happens when the most compassionate pirate in history inherits the memories of the most ruthless? We get Luffy struggling with tactical genius he never learned, fighting techniques from 40 years ago, and the crushing weight of knowing he was once everything he stands against. Then his crew has to decide, do they still follow Monkey D. Luffy, or are they now serving the reincarnated king of pirates who once made the world government tremble? This story is going to blow your mind, so smash that like button and let's jump right in. The Thousand Sunny cut through calm waters under a blazing afternoon sun, her lion figurehead gleaming as if it were grinning at some private joke. Luffy sat cross-legged on his favorite spot atop the sheep's head, straw hat tilted back as he scanned the horizon with that restless energy that always meant trouble was coming. "Land ho!" he suddenly bellowed, shooting to his feet and nearly tumbling into the ocean in his excitement. "There's an island, and it looks weird." Nami scrambled up from her deck chair, log pose in hand, squinting at the dark smudge rising from the sea ahead. Her expression shifted from annoyed to puzzled. "That's strange, this island isn't on any of my charts." "Mysterious island," Chopper's eyes went star-shaped. "Maybe there are mysterious island animals. Or mysterious island ladies," Brook added hopefully, adjusting his top hat. Zoro cracked one eye open from his napping spot against the mast. "Everything's mysterious to you idiots, it's probably just another boring rock." But as they drew closer, even Zoro had to admit this place was different. The island loomed before them like a sleeping giant, all jagged black cliffs and twisted metal structures jutting from the stone like broken teeth. Ancient fortifications scarred the coastline, their walls crumbling but still somehow menacing. A thick fog clung to the upper reaches, hiding whatever lay beyond the rocky shores. "Creepy," Usopp muttered, his knees already knocking. "Very, very creepy. Maybe we should just sail past this one, you know." "I'm getting a bad feeling about." "It's Hachi no Su," Robin said quietly, lowering her spyglass. Her voice carried that particular weight it got when she recognized something from history. Blackbeard's old stronghold. That got everyone's attention. Sanji stopped stirring his soup. Frankie looked up from tinkering with some gadget. Even Jinbei emerged from below deck, his expression grave. "Teach's Island," Jinbei's brow furrowed. "I thought it was destroyed during his final battle." "Apparently not," Robin replied, though she looked troubled. "Though it certainly seems abandoned now." Luffy's grin stretched wide. "Abandoned island means adventure, and maybe treasure." "Luffy, no," Nami started, but she was already too late. Her captain had stretched his arms back, rubber limbs coiling with familiar intent. "Gum gum." Rocket, and just like that, he was airborne, launched toward the mysterious island with his usual complete disregard for planning, safety, or common sense. "Luffy!" the crew shouted in unison, but their captain was already a rubber dot bouncing across the rocky shore. "Why do we even bother making plans?" Nami sighed, rubbing her temples. "Sanji, bring us to shore, carefully, who knows what traps Blackbeard might have left behind." 20 minutes later, the crew had managed a more controlled landing on a crescent-shaped beach of black sand. The place felt hollow, like walking through the skeleton of some enormous beast. Rusted cannons pointed out to sea from crumbling battlements. Tattered black flags bearing the crossed bones of the Blackbeard pirates hung limp in the still air. "Cheerful place," Sanji commented, lighting a cigarette. "Really screams vacation destination." Luffy was already ahead of them, poking around a collapsed watchtower with the curiosity of a child in a toy store. "This is so cool. Look at the size of these cannon balls." He hefted a rusty sphere bigger than his head. "I bet they could blow a hole clean through a marine battleship." "Please don't try to test that theory," Nami said quickly. They made their way inland, following what had once been a main thoroughfare carved into the rock. The architecture was brutal, all sharp angles and aggressive spikes designed to intimidate. But nature was slowly reclaiming it. Vines crept through cracks in the stone, and small trees had taken root in collapsed sections. "There," Robin pointed toward a massive structure looming ahead. "That looks like it was the main fortress." The building was a monument to intimidation, all black stone and iron spikes rising from the cliff face like a crown of thorns. But what caught everyone's attention was the enormous Jolly Roger carved into the rock above the entrance, not Blackbeard's flag, but something older, much older. That's not Teach's symbol, Zoro observed, hand instinctively moving to his sword hilts. Robin approached the carving, her eyes wide with recognition. No, this predates Blackbeard by decades. This is, she paused, consulting a small notebook. This is the symbol of the Rock's pirates. The name sent a chill through the group. Even those who didn't know the full history had heard whispers, the crew so dangerous that the world government had tried to erase them from history entirely. Rox D. Xebec, Jinbei said quietly. The man they called the most dangerous pirate who ever lived. More dangerous than Whitebeard? Chopper asked in a small voice. Different kind of dangerous, Jinbei replied. Whitebeard wanted a family, Roger wanted adventure. Rox wanted to tear down the world and rebuild it in his image. Luffy had wandered closer to the entrance while they talked, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The carved Jolly Roger seemed to pull at him, like a magnet he couldn't resist. Luffy, be careful, Usopp called. Places like this are always booby-trapped. There could be poisoned darts or falling rocks but Luffy wasn't listening. He reached out and pressed his palm against the ancient stone carving, fingers tracing the weathered lines of the skull and crossbones. The moment his skin touched the stone, the world shifted. Flash. A massive fleet spread across the horizon, black sails blotting out the sun. The roar of cannons, the clash of steel, victory after bloody victory. Flash, standing on a deck looking down at kneeling marine admirals. The taste of absolute power, the intoxicating rush of being feared by the entire world. Flash, a younger Whitebeard, barely more than a boy, swearing loyalty with fire in his eyes. A wild-haired woman who would become Big Mom, laughing as she devoured an entire feast. A blue-scaled fishman who moved like lightning. Luffy stumbled backward, gasping. For just a moment his eyes had gone unfocused, seeing something that wasn't there. Luffy, Chopper was at his side instantly, tiny hooves patting his arm. Are you okay? You looked really weird there for a second. I'm fine, Luffy said, but his voice came out strangely hoarse. He blinked hard, shaking his head. Just felt dizzy for a second, must be hungry. When aren't you hungry? Nami asked, but her tone was concerned rather than exasperated. Luffy managed his usual grin, but something felt different. Off, like there was an echo in his head where there hadn't been one before. Let's check out the inside. I want to see what Blackbeard was hiding here. The interior of the fortress was a maze of corridors and chambers carved directly from the living rock. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the darkness, and Frankie's flashlight beam revealed walls covered in faded murals depicting naval battles and conquest. This place is ancient, Robin murmured, examining the artwork. These paintings. They're not from Blackbeard's time. Some of these battles happened 40 years ago. They found themselves in what had once been a great hall, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow above. At the far end sat an enormous throne carved from black stone, its armrests shaped like grasping claws. The sight of it made everyone unconsciously slow their approach. Okay, that's definitely evil, Usopp whispered. Evil throne in an evil castle on an evil island. Can we go now? But Luffy was drawn forward like he'd been on the beach. Something about the throne felt familiar, though he couldn't say why. As he got closer, he could make out more details, scratches in the armrests where claws or knives had scored the stone. Dark stains that might have been blood. And carved into the back, barely visible in the dim light, were words in an ancient script. Robin, he called softly, can you read this? She joined him, squinting at the faded inscription. Her face went pale as she worked out the translation. Here sits the one who would break the cycle, she read slowly. Let the gods tremble, for their tyranny ends with me. Cheerful guy, Sanji commented from across the hall, but his usual sarcasm sounded forced. Luffy reached out to touch the carved words, but before his fingers could make contact, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the fortress. What was that? Chopper squeaked, diving behind Zoro's legs. Another crash, followed by an angry roar that definitely didn't sound human. Sounds like we're not alone, Zoro said, drawing Wado Ichimonji with a familiar grin. Finally, something straightforward he could deal with. They followed the sounds through twisting corridors until they emerged into what had once been a courtyard. Vines and moss covered everything, but in the center prowled something that made everyone tense up. It looked like a cross between a gorilla and a rhinoceros, easily 15 feet tall, with armored hide and tusks that gleamed like ivory daggers. Island Guardian Beast, Chopper yelled. Very big Island Guardian Beast. The creature spotted them and let out another earth-shaking roar, pawing the ground like a bull preparing to charge. All right, big guy, Luffy said, cracking his knuckles. Let's dance. He launched himself forward with his usual reckless enthusiasm, but something was different. His movements were more controlled, more precise. Instead of his typical wild swinging, he seemed to flow around the beast's attacks like water, striking with surgical accuracy. Zoro noticed it first. What the hell? Luffy's fighting stance had shifted subtly, his balance lower, his guard tighter. When the beast charged, instead of meeting it head-on like usual, Luffy sidestepped and delivered a devastating counterpunch to its ribs that sent the massive creature tumbling. "Since when does Luffy fight like that?" Nami asked, voicing what they were all thinking. The beast recovered and came at him again, but Luffy was already moving. His observation haki seemed sharper, more refined. He anticipated the creature's attacks not just seconds ahead, but predicting its entire strategy. It was like watching someone who had fought this exact battle 100 times before. The fight ended quickly. One final, perfectly placed punch to the solar plexus, and the beast collapsed, unconscious but breathing. "Phew," Luffy said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That was fun." He was pretty strong, but as he turned back to his crew, he noticed their stares. "What, do I have something on my face?" "Luffy," Zoro said carefully, "where did you learn to fight like that?" "Like what?" Like you've been doing it for 40 years. Luffy blinked, confused. "I don't know what you mean, I fought like I always fight." But even as he said it, something nagged at the back of his mind. He had felt different during the battle. More experienced, like his body remembered movements his mind had never learned. "It was probably just instinct," he said, but the words felt hollow even to him. Robin was watching him with that analytical look she got when trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. "Luffy, when you touched that stone carving earlier, what exactly did you see?" "I told you, I just got dizzy." But the dreams, if that's what they were, came flooding back. Ships burning on the horizon, the weight of a crown that wasn't his, the intoxicating rush of absolute power. "I think we should explore more," he said quickly, changing the subject. "Maybe there's treasure hidden somewhere." They spent the rest of the afternoon combing through the ruins. Robin found a library filled with water-damaged texts, most too degraded to read, but containing tantalizing fragments about the Age of Tyranny and something called Operation God Valley. Frankie discovered workshops with technology decades ahead of its time. Sanji found kitchens that could have fed armies, but it was in a sealed chamber deep beneath the throne room that they made the most disturbing discovery. The room was perfectly preserved, protected by some kind of climate control system that was still functioning after all these years. The walls were covered in maps not of islands or sea routes, but of something far more ambitious. World maps showing trade routes, marine bases, government facilities. Red X's marked locations labeled with things like ancient weapon research and void century archives. In the center of the room sat a desk, and on that desk lay an open journal, its pages yellow with age but still legible. Robin approached it carefully as if it might bite her. The handwriting was bold, aggressive, each letter carved into the paper with violent intensity. "Day 1847 of the new era," she read aloud. "The world government grows bolder in their lies. They paint us as criminals while they commit genocide in the shadows. But I will not allow the D-clan to fade into their manufactured history. I will break their cycle of oppression, even if I must burn the world to do it." She flipped to another page. "Newgate questions my methods. He thinks there is honor in their system, that we can change things through strength alone. Fool. Honor is a luxury the dead cannot afford. The only language these gods understand is fear, and I will teach them fluency." Another page. Linlin brings word from Whole Cake Island. "The government has begun targeting civilians with D names. Children, Newgate, they're killing children to prevent another Joy Boy from rising. My patience for half measures is at an end." The entries grew darker, more desperate. Plans for raids on government facilities. Lists of world noble families marked for retribution. Sketches of weapons that looked suspiciously like the ancient weapons from legend. And on the final page, written in shaking handwriting, "They come for me tomorrow. Roger and that damned Marine have finally found God Valley. I can hear their ships on the horizon. If I fall here, let this record stand as testament I tried to save this world from its chains. Perhaps the next bearer of the D will have better luck or better methods." The room fell silent except for the distant crash of waves against the cliffs outside. "He knew he was going to die," Jinbei said quietly. "And he was planning something that would have changed everything. Or destroyed everything," Nami countered. "This Rocks guy sounds completely insane." "Was he though?" Robin asked, still studying the journal. "Look at these government documents he collected. Evidence of slavery, genocide, the systematic elimination of entire bloodlines, if even half of this is true." "It doesn't justify what he planned to do," Sanji said firmly. You don't fight monsters by becoming one. Luffy had been unusually quiet during the discussion, staring at the journal with an expression his crew had never seen before, something between recognition and revulsion. Luffy, Chopper tugged on his pants leg. You're being scary quiet. Luffy started, then stopped. How could he explain the strange familiarity he felt reading those words? How could he tell them that somewhere deep in his mind, a voice was whispering that Rox had been right about the government, even if his methods were wrong? I think we should go, he said finally. This place. It doesn't feel right. They gathered their things and made their way back to the surface, but the oppressive atmosphere of the ruins followed them. As they emerged into the fading daylight, Luffy found himself drawn once more to the carved Jolly Roger above the entrance. This time he didn't reach out to touch it, but as he stared at the weathered skull, he could swear it was staring back. The cycle, he murmured, remembering the inscription on the throne. What cycle? Brook asked, having overheard. Nothing, Luffy said quickly, just thinking out loud. But as they sailed away from Hachinosu Island, Luffy stood at the stern of the Sunny and watched the dark cliffs disappear into the distance. Something had changed in that place. Some door in his mind had been opened that he wasn't sure he could close again. The dreams that had felt so foreign that morning now seemed almost familiar, like memories that belonged to someone else but had somehow become his own. I feel like I've been here before, he said to the empty ocean, not realizing Brook was close enough to hear. The skeleton musician felt a chill run through his bones that had nothing to do with the sea breeze, and for the first time in years, Brook remembered what it was like to be afraid of ghosts. Behind them, Hachinosu Island sank below the horizon, but its shadows had already taken root in places deeper than the sea. The cycle was beginning again. The nightmares started 3 days after they left Hachinosu. Luffy had always been a heavy sleeper, the kind who could snore through thunderstorms, Sea King attacks, and Sanji's loudest kitchen explosions. So when Chopper found him sitting bolt upright in his hammock at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat and staring at nothing, it was cause for concern. Luffy, the little reindeer's voice was barely a whisper. Are you okay? For a moment, Luffy didn't seem to hear him. His eyes were unfocused, looking through Chopper rather than at him, and his breathing came in short, sharp gasps like he'd been running. When he finally blinked and seemed to see his doctor, the confusion on his face was almost heartbreaking. Chopper, what? Where am I? You're on the Sunny in your room. You were having a nightmare, I think. Luffy wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, surprised to find it soaking wet. A nightmare? I don't remember. But even as he said it, fragments came flooding back. The taste of smoke and gunpowder, the weight of a crown that burned like molten gold, standing on a deck slick with blood while marine ships burned on the horizon. He started, then stopped. How could he explain that in his dream he'd been someone else entirely? Someone who commanded through fear rather than friendship, who crushed his enemies without mercy or second thought. Want to talk about it? Chopper climbed into the hammock beside him, his small form radiating warmth and concern. I don't think I can, Luffy said honestly. It felt so real, but it wasn't me. Does that make sense? It didn't, but Chopper nodded anyway. Sometimes dreams are weird like that. Maybe you're just stressed from that creepy island. Yeah, Luffy agreed, though he wasn't convinced. Maybe that's it. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning found Luffy picking at his breakfast in a way that immediately had the entire crew on edge. Monkey D. Luffy didn't pick at food. He inhaled it, fought over it, stretched his arms halfway across the table to steal it from other people's plates. Seeing him push scrambled eggs around his plate like he'd lost his appetite was like seeing the sun rise in the west. Okay, that's it, Nami declared, slamming her coffee cup down hard enough to rattle the table. What's wrong with you? Nothing's wrong, Luffy said automatically, but even he could hear how unconvincing it sounded. You've eaten maybe 3 bites, Sanji observed from his position at the stove, cigarette dangling from his lips. Yesterday you devoured an entire Sea King and complained you were still hungry. Today you're treating my perfectly cooked eggs like they personally insulted you. I'm just not hungry right now. The table fell silent. Even Usopp stopped mid-bite to stare at their captain in horror. Not hungry? Brook's jaw literally dropped, his skull hitting the table with a click. Luffy, should we prepare for the apocalypse? Because I'm pretty sure those were the exact words that herald the end of the world. Very funny, Luffy muttered, but there was no real irritation in his voice. He seemed distracted, like he was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Robin studied him with that analytical look she got when solving ancient puzzles. Have you been sleeping well? You look tired. I'm fine, he insisted, but his hand unconsciously went to his temple, massaging it like he had a headache. Clearly, Zoro said dryly, which is why you look like death warmed over and you're acting like someone replaced our captain with his evil twin. Before Luffy could protest, the ship's alarm started blaring. Usopp's voice crackled over the Den Mushi, marine ships approaching from the northeast. Looks like a full squadron. The effect on the crew was immediate. Chairs scraped back, weapons were grabbed, and everyone moved with the practiced efficiency of a group who'd faced this scenario dozens of times before. But Luffy's reaction was different. Instead of his usual excited grin at the prospect of a fight, his expression went cold and calculating in a way that made Zoro's hand instinctively move to his sword. "How many ships?" Luffy asked, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his 19-year-old throat. Usopp's voice was confused. 5 battleships, looks like. Pretty standard formation, nothing we can't handle if we— No, Luffy interrupted, standing so abruptly his chair fell over backward. That's not a standard formation, look again. The crew exchanged glances. Since when did Luffy know anything about marine formations? Actually, Usopp said after a moment, now that you mention it, they are moving kind of weird, like they're trying to herd us toward— Oh crap. There's another squadron coming from the southwest. A pincer movement, Luffy said matter-of-factly. They want us to run northeast into the doldrums where their backup fleet is waiting. Classic Admiral Sengoku Tactical Manual, Chapter 7. The silence that followed was deafening. "Since when do you read tactical manuals?" Nami asked slowly. Luffy blinked, looking as surprised as anyone. I don't know. I just knew that's what they were doing." "Right," Robin said, though her tone suggested nothing was right about this at all. "So what do you suggest we do?" For just a moment, something flickered across Luffy's face, an expression of cold calculation that belonged on the face of a seasoned admiral, not a rubber-powered teenager. "We break their center formation with a direct assault, then use the confusion to escape south-southeast toward the next island chain. They won't expect us to charge straight at their strongest position." "That's—" Jinbei started, then stopped, his expression troubled. "That's actually a very sound strategy. Risky, but sound." "Of course it is," Luffy said, then seemed to catch himself. His expression shifted back to something more familiar, confused and slightly worried. "I mean, let's just punch our way through, that always works." But the damage was done. His crew was staring at him like he'd grown a second head. "Luffy," Sanji said carefully, "are you feeling all right?" Because that sounded like something a marine strategist would say, not, "Well, you." Before Luffy could answer, the first cannon balls started falling around the ship. The battle was upon them whether they were ready or not. "Questions later," Zoro growled, drawing his swords. "Fighting now." The battle that followed would be talked about in marine circles for years afterward, though not for the reasons anyone expected. The Straw Hat crew had always been formidable, but there was usually a chaotic, improvised quality to their victories. They won through determination, luck, and Luffy's uncanny ability to inspire everyone around him to fight beyond their limits. Today was different. Today, they moved like a precision instrument. It started with Luffy's positioning. Instead of launching himself directly at the nearest marine ship like usual, he directed his crew with surgical precision. Zoro to the port side to counter their sword specialists. Sanji launching skyward to take out their sniper nests. Frankie providing covering fire, while Nami adjusted their course to exploit gaps in the enemy formation that shouldn't have been visible to anyone without decades of naval combat experience. Chopper, medical support for anyone who needs it, but stay low. They've got sharpshooters in the crow's nests of ships 2 and 4, Luffy called out, pointing to locations he couldn't possibly see from his position. "How do you know that?" Chopper yelled back, but he followed the order anyway. "Brook, disable their communications. They're coordinating through Den Mushi on a scrambled frequency, probably channel 7 or 8. Brook blinked in surprise. "That's very specific, Captain. Just do it." The skeleton musician saluted and launched into action, his sword singing as he sliced through communication lines with impossible precision. Meanwhile, Luffy himself moved through the battle like a force of nature, but a controlled one. His usual wild, instinctive fighting style had been refined into something altogether more lethal. He still used his rubber powers, but now there was a calculated efficiency to every move. He struck weak points in ship hulls that would cause maximum damage with minimum effort. He anticipated enemy attacks not just seconds in advance, but seemed to read their entire battle plan. When a Marine captain tried to flank him with a squad of sword fighters, Luffy didn't just dodge. He maneuvered them into a position where Zoro could take them all out with a single technique. When cannons fired, he didn't just avoid them, he deflected them in such a way that they struck enemy ships instead. This is incredible, Robin breathed, watching from her position near the mast. It's like he's fought this exact battle before. Multiple times, Jinbei added, sounding deeply unsettled. The way he's moving, the tactical decisions, I've seen this kind of combat instinct before, but only in veterans with decades of experience. The battle ended quickly. The Marine squadron, expecting to face the usual chaotic Straw Hat assault, found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by a crew that suddenly seemed to have gained 20 years of combat experience overnight. As the enemy ships limped away, nursing severe damage and thoroughly beaten, the Straw Hats gathered on deck. They should have been celebrating, but the mood was subdued. "All right," Nami said finally, crossing her arms and fixing Luffy with the kind of stare that usually preceded a beating. "Explain now." "Explain what? Don't play dumb. You just outmaneuvered 5 Marine battleships like you were playing chess with children. You knew their formation, their tactics, their communication protocols. Where did that come from?" Luffy opened his mouth to give his usual non-answer, but the words died in his throat. Because the honest truth was, he didn't know where it came from. During the battle, it had felt as natural as breathing. Every tactical decision had seemed obvious, like following a script he'd memorized but couldn't remember learning. I could see what they were going to do," he said weakly. "People don't just develop tactical genius overnight," Robin observed. "This level of strategic thinking takes years to develop." "Maybe I'm just getting smarter," Luffy suggested hopefully. The look his crew gave him suggested they found that explanation about as convincing as he did. "This is connected to that island, isn't it?" Chopper asked quietly. "Ever since we left Hachinosu, you've been acting strange." "I'm not acting strange. You turned down meat yesterday," Usopp pointed out. "Meat, Luffy? You said you weren't in the mood for it. And this morning you stared at the ocean for an hour without saying a word," Nami added. "You never stare at anything for an hour unless it's food." Luffy looked around at his crew, his friends, his family, and saw the concern in their eyes. They weren't interrogating him out of suspicion, but out of love. They were worried about him, and that somehow made it worse. "I've been having weird dreams," he admitted finally. "Ever since that island, dreams where I'm someone else." Robin leaned forward, her historian's instincts kicking in. "Someone older, stronger, someone who," he struggled to find the words. "Someone who knew how to win battles like this. Someone who commanded fleets and fought Marines and," he trailed off, shaking his head. "It doesn't make sense, they're just dreams." But even as he said it, he could feel the weight of that golden crown on his head. Could taste the smoke of burning ships. Could hear the sound of his own voice, decades older and infinitely colder, giving orders that would reshape the world. That night, he dreamed again. This time, he was standing on the deck of a massive ship, bigger than anything he'd ever seen. The flag above him bore a skull and crossbones he recognized from the ruins of Hachinosu. Around him, his crew, but not his crew. Faces he knew but had never met. A younger Whitebeard, barely more than a boy but already massive, swinging a bicento with deadly precision. A wild-haired woman who laughed as she devoured enemies whole. A fishman whose speed in the water was unmatched. And in front of him, kneeling on the deck, was a Marine admiral. Not just any Admiral Sengoku himself, but younger, his afro black instead of gray. "You cannot stop the tide of change," the voice that came from his mouth said, though it felt deeper than his own. "The world government's reign of terror ends now." "You're insane," Sengoku spat, but there was fear in his eyes. "You'll destroy everything." "I'll destroy their lies," the voice replied. "The truth will set this world free, even if I have to burn every government facility to reveal it." The scene shifted. Now he was in a grand chamber, facing 5 silhouetted figures he somehow knew were the world government's highest authorities. They cowered before him, these supposed gods among men, reduced to trembling shadows. "The age of the celestial dragons is over," his voice boomed through the chamber. "The D-clan will not be exterminated in silence. We will not fade quietly into your manufactured history." One of the figures dared to speak. "You cannot hope to stand against the full might of," the response was swift and brutal. A wave of conquerors, hockey so powerful it cracked the stone walls, so focused it could stop hearts. The figure collapsed. "I don't hope," the voice said quietly. "I know." The dream shifted again to a final scene, standing on a cliff overlooking a harbor filled with both pirate and marine ships. In the distance, he could see 2 familiar figures approaching, a younger Garp and Gall D. Roger himself. "So it ends here," he heard himself say, but there was no regret in the voice, only grim satisfaction. "Let this be my legacy, that someone stood against the gods and made them bleed." The battle that followed was beyond anything Luffy had ever experienced, power that could split islands, hockey that could level mountains. And through it all, a burning certainty that this was necessary, that the world needed to be freed from its chains even if it meant dying to do it. The last thing he remembered was falling, his body broken but his spirit undefeated, knowing that somewhere in the future, someone would finish what he'd started. Luffy woke with a gasp, his heart pounding like he'd just run a marathon. But this time, he wasn't confused or disoriented. The dream had been too vivid, too detailed, too emotionally resonant to be mere imagination. He sat up in his hammock and stared at his hands in the moonlight streaming through the porthole. They looked the same as always, scarred from countless battles, still bearing the mark where he'd stabbed himself to prove his courage to Shanks all those years ago. But in the dream, they had been different, older, more calloused, hands that had held the fate of nations. Almost without thinking, he slipped out of his hammock and padded quietly to the deck. The night was clear, stars reflecting off the calm ocean like scattered diamonds. He found himself at the bow of the ship, staring out at the horizon where God Valley had once stood. He knelt and traced patterns in the dampness left by sea spray on the deck. Circles and lines, skulls and crossbones. It wasn't until he sat back that he realized what he'd drawn, the Jolly Roger from his dreams, rendered in perfect detail despite having seen it only once on the ruins of Hachinosu. The symbol of the Rock's pirates. Can't sleep either. Luffy spun around to find Robin approaching, a cup of tea in her hands and that thoughtful expression she wore when pieces of a historical puzzle were starting to fall into place. Just thinking, he said, quickly scrubbing away the drawing with his foot, but Robin had already seen it. Her eyes went wide as she recognized the symbol. Luffy, she said carefully, what exactly have you been dreaming about? For a long moment he considered lying. Considered brushing off her concern with his usual carefree attitude. But the weight of the dreams, the memories that felt more real than his own past, was becoming too heavy to carry alone. I think, he said slowly, choosing his words with unusual care, I might be remembering someone else's life. Robin set down her tea and sat beside him, waiting with the infinite patience of someone who understood that some truths took time to surface. Someone who commanded fleets, Luffy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone who fought the world government, someone who died trying to free the world from something terrible. He looked up at her, and in the moonlight, Robin could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a weight, a knowledge, a sorrow that belonged to someone far older than 19. Robin, he asked, do you believe in reincarnation? The question hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. In the distance, waves lapped against the Sunny's hull, and somewhere in the rigging, the wind hummed a lullaby for the sleeping sea. Robin stared at the scrubbed deck where the Jolly Roger had been, her mind racing through historical texts and ancient legends. Stories of souls that refused to rest until their work was done. Tales of the D Clan and their mysterious connection to the will of ages past. I believe, she said finally, that some wills are too strong to die with the body. Luffy nodded, unsurprised by her answer. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him had been expecting it. The cycle was turning, and Monkey D. Luffy was beginning to remember who he used to be. The conversation with Robin should have made things better. Having someone who believed him, who didn't look at him like he was losing his mind, should have been a relief. Instead, Luffy found himself lying awake the next morning, staring at the ceiling of his room as fragments of memories that weren't his own flickered through his consciousness like broken film reels. A massive woman, barely 17 but already towering over grown men, laughing as she demolished an entire banquet table. Captain, Captain, look how much I can eat. Her voice was different then, younger, without the madness that would come later. There had been genuine joy in those eyes, not the calculating hunger of an emperor. Luffy blinked, and the memory faded, leaving him staring at his own ceiling again. But the taste of that feast lingered in his mouth, flavors he'd never experienced but somehow remembered perfectly. This is getting ridiculous, he muttered to himself, swinging his legs over the side of his hammock. But even as he said it, another flash hit him. Standing on a beach, watching a blue-scaled fishman move through combat drills with liquid grace. Your technique is improving, but you're still holding back, his own voice said, though it sounded decades older. In a real fight, hesitation will get you killed. The fishman, barely more than a boy, nodded seriously. Yes, Captain Rocks. Jinbei, Luffy whispered, the name falling from his lips before he could stop it. But that was impossible. The fishman in the memory had been young, maybe 20, and Jinbei was. He shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the foreign thoughts. These weren't his memories. They couldn't be. He was Monkey D. Luffy, 17 years old, captain of the Straw Hat Pirates. He'd never commanded anyone before meeting his current crew. So why did he remember the weight of responsibility for dozens of lives? Why could he recall the precise way authority felt when it was absolute and unquestioned? Breakfast was becoming a minefield. Luffy sat at the table, mechanically chewing bacon while his crewmates chattered around him. Their voices felt distant, like he was hearing them through water. Every few minutes, another flash would hit fragments of conversations from a life that wasn't his. The world government is moving against the celestial dragon critics again, a younger Whitebeard reported, his voice tight with controlled anger. 3 more D family lines wiped out. They're calling it pirate raids. Of course they are, came the reply from his own mouth. Can't have the cattle knowing their shepherds are wolves. Luffy, Chopper's voice cut through the memory. You're doing that staring thing again. Sorry, just... Luffy rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes, thinking about stuff. Since when do you think about stuff? Usopp asked with forced cheerfulness. Usually you just do stuff and we figure out the thinking part afterward. People change, Luffy said absently, then froze. The words had come out in a tone he didn't recognize, older, wearier, carrying the weight of too many disappointments. Zoro's eye narrowed. Do they? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Luffy looked up to find his first mate studying him with that analytical expression usually reserved for worthy opponents. What's that supposed to mean? Just wondering if the Luffy who used to charge headfirst into every situation is the same one who's been acting like a chess master for the past week. I haven't been. You predicted that marine formation perfectly, Nami interrupted. You knew their communication protocols. Yesterday you told Brook the exact frequency their Den Den Mushi would be using before we even saw their ships. Lucky guess. 17 lucky guesses in a row, Sanji raised an eyebrow. Either you've suddenly become a tactical genius or something else is going on. Luffy opened his mouth to deny it, but another memory crashed into him like a tidal wave. Sitting in a war room, maps spread across a massive table. Dozens of captains listening as he outlined a plan to hit 3 marine bases simultaneously. The key is timing, his voice explained, tracing routes with a scarred finger. Hit Marineford's supply lines first, force them to divide their attention, then strike the real targets while they're scrambling to respond. A young Kaido, barely out of his teens but already massive, grinning with bloodthirsty enthusiasm. When do we start killing, Captain? When I say so and not before, came the sharp reply. This isn't about mindless violence. Every death serves a purpose or it doesn't happen at all. Luffy, Chopper was shaking his arm. You're scaring us, Luffy blinked, coming back to the present to find his entire crew staring at him with expressions ranging from concern to alarm. His hands were clenched into fists on the table, and he was breathing hard like he'd been running. Sorry, he managed. I was just remembering something. Remembering what? Robin asked gently. A war meeting, planning attacks on marine bases. The words tumbled out before he could stop them. There were maps and captains and someone asking about killing. The table fell silent except for the creak of the ship's timbers. Luffy, Jinbei said slowly, whose memory was that? I don't know. But even as he said it, he did know. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. Maybe someone who used to sit in a lot of war meetings. Robin exchanged a look with Jinbei. The Rocks pirates were known for their strategic brilliance. They could coordinate attacks across multiple islands simultaneously, something no other pirate crew had ever managed. You think I'm remembering that? Luffy asked, though part of him already knew the answer. I think, Robin said carefully, that memories have a way of finding their way back to where they belong. The afternoon brought no relief. If anything, the memories were getting stronger, more frequent. Luffy found himself walking the deck in a pattern he'd never learned but somehow knew by heart, the exact route a captain would take to inspect his ship and crew. He paused at the mast, running his hand along the wood, and for a moment he wasn't on the Thousand Sunny anymore. He was on a ship 3 times larger, surrounded by a crew of the most dangerous pirates the world had ever seen. The Saber of Xebec, they'd called it, a vessel built not for adventure but for war. Newgate, he said absently, looking at Zoro. Your stance is too rigid. In a real fight, you need to... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in horror. Zoro was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and alarm. What did you just call me? Nothing, sorry, I meant Zoro. But the damage was done. He could see the questions in his first mate's eyes, the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with their captain. Newgate was Whitebeard's family name, Robin said quietly. Edward Newgate. I know who Whitebeard was, Luffy snapped, then immediately felt guilty for the harshness in his voice. That hadn't sounded like him either. Discipline, Newgate, echoed in his memory. Your strength is impressive, but strength without control is just destruction. Learn to focus that power, or it will destroy everything you care about." The young man who would become the world's strongest man nodded seriously. "Yes, Captain, I'll do better. You're already doing well," came the surprisingly gentle reply. "I just want to make sure you survive long enough to reach your potential." Luffy shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the foreign memory. "This is insane. I don't know why I said that." "Because part of you remembers training him," Robin said softly. "That's impossible." "Is it?" She pulled out a small notebook, one of the many she used to record historical findings. "I've been researching since our conversation last night. There are legends among the older pirates about the D-clan stories that go back centuries. They say that sometimes, when the world needs it most, the will of a D can transcend death itself." "You're talking about reincarnation," Jinbei said, his voice troubled. "I'm talking about inherited will taken to its logical extreme." Robin flipped through pages covered in her careful handwriting. "What if some wills are so strong, so focused on a particular goal that they can't rest until that goal is achieved? That's..." Usopp started, then swallowed hard. "That's terrifying." "Is it?" Robin looked around the assembled crew. "Or is it hopeful? The idea that even death can't stop someone from fighting for what they believe in." Luffy barely heard the philosophical discussion. He was lost in another wave of memories, stronger than ever before. Standing before a massive crowd of pirates, all of them listening with rapt attention. "The world government calls us criminals," his voice boomed across the harbor. "They paint us as monsters who threaten innocent people. But tell me, who are the real monsters? The pirates who fight for freedom, or the government that commits genocide in the shadows?" Roars of agreement from the crowd. Fists raised in solidarity. The intoxicating rush of absolute loyalty from hundreds of the world's most dangerous individuals. They want to erase the D-clan from history because they know we represent everything they fear: the will to resist, to fight back, to refuse to bow down to false gods. But we will not be erased. We will not fade quietly into their manufactured history. More cheers, louder now, the taste of power, absolute and unquestioned. "Today, we begin the war to free this world from its chains." "Stop it," Luffy whispered, pressing his palms against his temples. "Stop it, stop it, stop it." But the memories kept coming. The first time he'd killed a celestial dragon, the way the man had screamed about his divine blood as he died like any other mortal. The satisfaction, no, the joy that had filled his chest as another link in the world's chains was broken. Planning the assassination of corrupt marine officers. Watching government facilities burn. The rush of pure, righteous anger as he discovered another mass grave filled with D-clan children. Standing over the broken body of a world noble, feeling nothing but contempt for their claims of godhood. "I enjoyed it," Luffy gasped, the words torn from his throat. "I enjoyed the killing. I enjoyed the fear in their eyes." The deck fell silent except for the sound of his ragged breathing. "Luffy," Chopper said in a small voice, "that wasn't you. That was someone else. But it feels like me." The words came out as a shout, raw and desperate. "It feels like my memories, my thoughts, my decisions. How do I know where Rocks ends and I begin?" It was Zoro who answered, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that had drawn Luffy to him in the first place. "Because you're asking the question." Luffy looked up at him, confusion clear on his face. "Someone who enjoyed killing wouldn't be horrified by the memory of it," Zoro explained. "Someone who is comfortable with cruelty wouldn't be fighting so hard against these thoughts. The fact that you're struggling with this proves you're still you. But what if I'm not?" The question came out smaller, more vulnerable than anything his crew had ever heard from their captain. "What if I become him? What if these memories change who I am?" "Then we'll remind you," Nami said firmly. "That's what crews are for." "We've seen you at your worst and your best," Sanji added. "A few borrowed memories aren't going to change that." "Besides," Brook interjected with forced lightness, "if you start getting too tyrannical, we'll just have to mutiny. Though I suppose as a skeleton I don't have the stomach for it." Yo-ho-ho-ho, despite everything, Luffy found himself smiling slightly at the terrible joke. "You guys are weird," says the rubber man who's apparently the reincarnation of history's most dangerous pirate, Usopp pointed out. The moment of levity faded as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and ominous. Nami frowned at her weather instruments, clearly not liking what she was seeing. "We need to change course," she announced. "There's a major storm system moving in from the east." "How major?" Frankie asked, already moving to secure loose equipment. "Major enough that we should find shelter if we can." But as she spoke, Luffy was already moving toward the helm with a confidence that seemed to come from nowhere. "No need, we can ride the edge of the system southeast, use the wind differential to boost our speed." Luffy, that's incredibly dangerous, Nami protested. One mistake and we'll be right in the heart of, trust me, he said, and there was something in his voice that made her hesitate. Not his usual cheerful confidence, but something deeper. The voice of someone who had navigated 1,000 storms. His hands moved over the controls with practiced ease, adjusting their course with precision that shouldn't have been possible for someone with his limited sailing experience. As the first winds hit them, he compensated perfectly, using the storm's own power to propel them forward at twice their normal speed. Incredible, Jinbei breathed, watching their captain work. That level of seamanship takes decades to develop. He's done this before, Robin observed quietly. Maybe not in this life, but somewhere in those memories, he's navigated storms like this dozens of times. The crew watched in awed silence as Luffy guided them through conditions that should have been impossible for a ship their size to handle. Every adjustment was perfect, every course correction exactly what was needed. It was like watching a master musician play a familiar piece, beautiful, precise, and utterly effortless. When they finally emerged from the storm's edge into calm waters, Luffy stepped back from the helm and seemed to deflate slightly, the borrowed confidence fading back into confusion. "I don't know how I did that," he admitted. "But you did it," Zoro said simply. "That's what matters." "Is it?" Luffy looked out at the calm seas ahead, his expression troubled. "What happens when these memories get stronger? What happens when I start making decisions based on what he would do instead of what I want to do?" "Then you remember that you have us," Robin said firmly. "You remember that you chose this crew, this adventure, this path. Whatever Rox D. Xebec wanted, whatever drove him, that's not what drives you. What if it becomes what drives me? Then we'll drag you back to yourself," Nami said, with the kind of determination that had carried them through every crisis they'd faced. "As many times as it takes." Luffy nodded slowly, but the doubt remained in his eyes. The memories were getting stronger, more insistent. And somewhere in the depths of his mind, he could feel something else awakening, not just knowledge, but purpose. The same burning drive that had once motivated a man to declare war on the gods themselves. The question wasn't whether the memories would continue to surface. The question was whether Monkey D. Luffy would still exist when they were done. As night fell and the crew settled in for the evening, Luffy remained at the bow, staring out at stars that seemed familiar despite being in a part of the sky he'd never sailed before. In the distance, he could swear he heard the sound of cannon fire and the clash of steel on steel. The ghost of Rox D. Xebec was growing stronger, and Luffy wasn't sure how much longer he could hold him back. Behind him, unnoticed by anyone else, Robin made a note in her journal. Day 6 since Hachinosu. Subject showing increasing signs of memory integration. Personality changes becoming more pronounced. Recommend monitoring closely for signs of complete assimilation. She paused, then added, Question, at what point does inherited will become possession? The answer, she feared, might come sooner than any of them were ready for. The morning sun cast long shadows across Lodestar Island as the Thousand Sunny approached its rocky shores. Unlike Hachinosu, this place didn't radiate menace or ancient power. Instead, it felt hollow like a wound in the world that had never properly healed. Luffy stood at the bow, but his usual excitement at reaching a new island was nowhere to be found. The closer they got to Lodestar, the heavier the feeling in his chest became. It was familiar in a way that made his skin crawl, the kind of recognition that came not from his own experiences, but from memories that belonged to someone else. Strange place to build a lighthouse, Frankie observed, pointing at a tall white structure perched on the island's highest cliff. No shipping lanes run through here anymore. That's not a lighthouse, Robin said quietly, lowering her spyglass. Her face had gone pale. It's a monument. Monument to what? Usopp asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. To God Valley. The name hit the crew like a physical blow. Even those who didn't know the complete history had heard whispers. The battle that had ended the Rock's pirates, the place where legends died, the island that had mysteriously vanished from all maps afterward. Luffy felt something twist in his stomach, a mixture of anticipation and dread that didn't belong to him. He gripped the ship's railing hard enough to leave finger marks in the wood. We shouldn't be here, he said suddenly. Why not? Nami asked, though she was already checking her compass and weather instruments, looking for any excuse to change course. Because, Luffy struggled to put the feeling into words. Because this is where it all went wrong. The island was larger than it had appeared from the sea, with rolling hills covered in wild grass that had clearly once been cultivated fields. Scattered throughout the landscape were chunks of worked stone pillars, foundations, fragments of walls, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that could never be put back together. There was a city here once, Robin observed, kneeling to examine a piece of carved marble. A significant one based on the architecture. What happened to it? Chopper asked, his voice small in the vast emptiness. The same thing that happened to the people who lived here, she replied grimly. They followed an overgrown path that led inland, past the remains of what might have been houses or shops. The silence was oppressive, no birds, no insects, no sound except the whisper of wind through abandoned ruins. Luffy walked slightly ahead of the group, his movements mechanical, like he was following a route from muscle memory. Several times he turned down paths that seemed to lead nowhere, only to discover hidden passages or concealed entrances that shouldn't have been visible from the surface. How does he know where he's going? Sanji muttered to Zoro. Same way he's known everything else lately, Zoro replied. He's been here before. That's impossible. This place was destroyed decades before any of us were born. Yeah, well, a lot of impossible things have been happening lately. Their destination turned out to be a partially collapsed building near the island's center, its walls covered in vines but still standing after all these years. Unlike the other ruins, this one showed signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust, scorch marks that looked fresh, the remnants of a campfire. Someone else has been here, Jinbei noted, examining the tracks. Recently, before anyone could respond, Luffy had pushed through the building's entrance, moving with the kind of urgency that usually preceded either great discovery or terrible danger. His crew followed, weapons ready, but found themselves in what appeared to be an abandoned office. Desks overturned, papers scattered everywhere, filing cabinets torn open and emptied. But in the back corner, hidden behind a false wall that Luffy somehow knew how to open, was a room that had escaped the destruction. World Government Archive, Robin breathed, reading the faded lettering above the door. Classification level, absolute secret. The room beyond was filled with filing cabinets, each one marked with dates, locations, and operation names. Most were empty, their contents long since removed or destroyed. But a few had been overlooked, tucked away in corners, or hidden behind other files. Robin moved through the room like a scholar in paradise, carefully extracting documents and scanning their contents. Her expressions grew progressively more horrified as she read. "This is," she started, then stopped, shaking her head. "These are records of systematic extermination campaigns." "Against who?" Nami asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Anyone with a D initial in their name. Entire families, entire bloodlines. Men, women, children, it didn't matter." Robin held up a document with trembling hands. "Operation Clean Slate, the complete elimination of the bloodline from all four blues and the first half of the Grand Line." The room fell silent except for the rustle of papers as Robin continued reading. "They weren't just killing pirates," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were targeting civilians. Farmers, merchants, fishermen, anyone whose name contained the initial D. The official records list them as pirate collaborators or insurgent sympathizers, but the real documents." She held up another file. "The real documents call it prophylactic population control. They were trying to prevent another Joy Boy," Jinbei said grimly. "Or another Rocks," Robin corrected. "These files date from the height of the Rocks pirates' power. The world government was terrified that more D-clan members would rally to his banner." Luffy had been unusually quiet during this exchange, standing in the center of the room with his eyes closed. Now he moved to a specific filing cabinet, his hands going to a drawer that looked no different from any other. "This one," he said with quiet certainty. Inside were documents that made even the extermination orders pale in comparison. Detailed plans for something called Operation God Valley, not just a battle plan, but a complete societal restructuring program. "They weren't just planning to kill Rocks," Robin said as she read. "They were planning to rewrite history itself. Make it look like the battle was a heroic marine victory over evil pirates, hide all evidence of the D-clan genocide, create a narrative where the world government were the good guys saving innocent people." She pulled out a photograph that made everyone lean forward. It showed God Valley before the battle, a thriving island nation with cities, farms, and what looked like a major port. But written across the image in red ink were the words, "Acceptable casualties. Total population. They were going to kill everyone," Chopper whispered. "Everyone who lived here. Everyone who could testify to what they'd seen," Robin confirmed. God Valley wasn't just Rock's base of operations, it was a refuge. He'd been gathering D-clan survivors here, people who'd escaped the government's purges. Luffy's hands clenched into fists. They weren't just fighting pirates. They were covering up genocide. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Standing in this very room, not ruins then, but a functioning command center, papers spread across a massive table. His own voice, decades older and infinitely harder, "They're not coming to fight us, they're coming to erase us." Young Whitebeard, barely 18, his face twisted with rage. "Then we make them pay for every life they've taken." "No," came the reply. "We make them face the truth they've been hiding, even if it means dying to do it." "He knew," Luffy said suddenly, his voice carrying that strange authority that had been creeping in more often. Rox knew this was a genocide, not a war. He knew Roger and Garp weren't coming to arrest him, they were coming to complete the extermination. "How could you possibly know that?" Nami asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Instead of responding, Luffy walked to another section of the room, this one containing personal effects rather than official documents. His hands went directly to a small wooden box tucked behind a larger container. Inside was a journal bound in cracked leather, its pages yellow with age but still legible. The handwriting was bold, aggressive, each letter carved into the paper with violent intensity, handwriting that was becoming disturbingly familiar. "Final entry," Luffy read aloud, though his voice sounded strange, like he was reciting from memory rather than reading. "They come at dawn. Roger and that damned Marine have finally tracked us to our last sanctuary. I can hear their ships on the horizon." He flipped pages, his movements growing more agitated. "I know what this is, not a battle, but an execution. They will kill everyone on this island, my crew, the refugees, the children who have never held a weapon in their lives. All to maintain the lie that the D clan doesn't exist." His voice began to shake. "I have failed them, all of them. I wanted to free this world from its chains, but I became the very thing I fought against. I used fear where I should have inspired hope. I chose domination when I should have chosen liberation." The page was stained with what might have been tears or blood. "If there is any justice in this world, if the will of D truly transcends death, let someone else finish what I started. Let them succeed where I failed. Let them save this world with love instead of hate." Luffy closed the journal with hands that were trembling. When he looked up, his eyes held a depth of sorrow that belonged to someone far older. "He regretted it," he said quietly. "At the end, he regretted everything except trying to save people." "Luffy," Robin said gently, "that's not your guilt to carry, isn't it?" He looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of decades. "If I'm him, if these are my memories, then it is my guilt, all those people who died because I chose the wrong methods." "You didn't choose anything," Zoro said firmly. "That was someone else in another life. You're not responsible for his mistakes." Before Luffy could argue, a new voice cut through the conversation like a blade, but he might repeat them. Everyone spun toward the entrance to find a figure silhouetted against the daylight. As he stepped into the room, his identity became clear. Vice Admiral Monkey D. Garp, hero of the Marines, grandfather of their captain, and the man who had helped bring down the Rocks pirates 38 years ago. "Gramps," Luffy's voice cracked slightly on the word. Garp's expression was unreadable as he studied his grandson. "Been wondering when you turn up here, brat, though I have to say, watching you walk straight to all the right places. That was disturbing. How long have you been following us?" Nami demanded, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon. "Long enough to know that something's gone very wrong with my idiot grandson." Garp's eyes never left Luffy's face. "You move like him now, talk like him. Hell, you even stand like him when you think no one's watching." "Like who?" Usopp asked, though his voice suggested he really didn't want to know. "Like Rox D. Xebec." The name came out like a curse. "The most dangerous man who ever lived, and apparently he's not as dead as we thought." The tension in the room ratcheted up several degrees. Hands moved to weapons, devil fruit powers flickered at the edges of perception, and for a moment it looked like the archive might become a battlefield. But Luffy just stood there, staring at his grandfather with an expression of such profound sadness that it stopped everyone in their tracks. "You were there," he said quietly. "At the end, you saw him die." "I helped kill him," Garp replied without flinching, "and I'd do it again if I had to, even knowing what you know now about the genocide." "About what the government was really doing?" Garp's expression flickered just for a moment, but long enough for everyone to see the doubt there. "Orders are orders. That's not what you believed then." Luffy's voice was growing stronger, more confident. "I remember." No, he remembered. "At the end, when it was just you and him and Roger, you looked at the bodies of all those refugees and you threw up. The great Marine hero, vomiting at the sight of what his government had done. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Luffy stepped forward, and for a moment he seemed taller, older, carrying himself with the authority of someone who had commanded fleets. You stayed up all night after the battle, didn't you? Wondering if you'd fought on the right side, wondering if the man you'd killed had been the real hero all along. Garp's hand moved to his fist, but it was shaking. He was a monster. He was trying to save people the only way he knew how. Luffy's voice carried a weight of conviction that silenced any argument. And he failed because he forgot that you can't build a better world on a foundation of bodies. The two Marines stared at each other across the dusty archive room, grandson and grandfather, past and present, truth and the lies people tell themselves to sleep at night. Finally, Garp spoke. What are you going to do about it? About what? About the fact that every day you're becoming more like him, about the fact that his memories are taking over your mind. About the fact that in a few weeks, there might not be any Monkey D. Luffy left, just Rox D. Xebec wearing his face. The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Luffy looked around at his crew, his family, his chosen bonds, the people who had followed him across the world not because they feared him but because they loved him. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know how to stop it. I don't even know if I want to. Luffy, Chopper said in a small voice. No, listen. He turned to address them all, his expression more serious than they'd ever seen it. What if this is why it happened? What if the reason I'm remembering his life is because there's still work to do? The world government is still out there. They're still covering up genocides, still lying to the world, still calling themselves heroes while they commit atrocities in the shadows. That doesn't mean you have to become him, Nami said desperately. Doesn't it? He looked at her with eyes that held too much knowledge, too much pain. Maybe the only way to finish what he started is to accept what he was. Maybe I need to stop fighting these memories and start learning from them. And what happens to us? Robin asked quietly. What happens to the crew that chose to follow Monkey D. Luffy, not Rox D. Xebec? The question hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, the authority faded from his posture, and he looked like the teenager he actually was, confused, scared, and desperately trying to hold onto something that seemed to be slipping through his fingers. I don't know, he whispered. I don't know. Garp watched this exchange with an expression that might have been pity. Kid, let me give you some advice. I've seen what happens when good people convince themselves that evil methods serve good purposes. It doesn't end well. And what's your solution? Pretend the government isn't corrupt. Ignore the genocide, let them keep lying to the world. Find another way. That's what heroes do. They find a way to save people without becoming monsters themselves. Luffy laughed, but there was no humor in it. Heroes, is that what you think you were? You helped cover up the murder of an entire island. You let them rewrite history to hide their crimes. What kind of hero does that? Garp flinched as if struck. The kind who was young and stupid and believed his superiors when they told him it was for the greater good. And what about now? What do you believe now? The old Marine was quiet for a long moment, staring at the scattered documents that told the true story of God Valley. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with decades of regret. I believe, he said slowly, that some shadows from the past are too heavy for any one person to carry, Brat. Even someone as stubborn as you. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. But if you're determined to carry them anyway, make sure you remember who you really are underneath all that borrowed darkness. Because once you lose that, he shook his head. Once you lose that, there's no coming back. And with that warning echoing in the dusty air, Vice Admiral Garp walked back into the sunlight, leaving the Straw Hat Pirates alone with the ghosts of God Valley and the growing certainty that their captain was slipping away from them one memory at a time. In the silence that followed, Luffy picked up Rock's journal again and held it against his chest like a talisman. The weight of inherited purpose was growing stronger every day, and somewhere in the depths of his mind, he could feel an ancient will stirring to life. The question wasn't whether Rox D. Xebec would return. The question was whether Monkey D. Luffy would survive his resurrection. The journal felt heavier in Luffy's hands than it should have, like it was made of lead instead of leather and paper. He'd been carrying it for 3 days now, ever since they'd left Lodestar Island, and every time he tried to put it down, something compelled him to pick it back up. His crew was giving him space, but he could feel their eyes on him. Worried glances, hushed conversations that stopped whenever he came within earshot. The weight of their concern was almost as heavy as the memories pressing against the inside of his skull. You haven't opened it yet. Luffy looked up to find Robin sitting across from him on the deck, a cup of tea steaming in her hands. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Sunny's deck, and somewhere in the distance, Usopp and Chopper were engaged in one of their usual ridiculous games. Normal sounds, normal life, everything that felt like it was slipping away from him. I'm scared too, he admitted. It was perhaps the first completely honest thing he'd said in days. Robin nodded like she'd been expecting it. What are you afraid you'll find? The truth. He ran his thumb along the journal's cracked binding. What if I read it and there's no going back? What if I find out who he really was and it changes everything? What if you don't read it and spend the rest of your life wondering? Luffy was quiet for a long moment, watching his crew go about their evening routines. Sanji in the kitchen, preparing dinner with his usual passionate precision. Zoro dozing against the mast, but Luffy could tell he was listening to every word. Nami updating her charts, Brook tuning his violin, Frankie tinkering with some new gadget. His family, his chosen bonds, the people who had followed him across the world not because they feared him, but because they believed in him. What if I'm not strong enough to stay myself? He asked quietly. Then we'll help you remember who you are, Robin said simply. That's what family does. Before Luffy could respond, a strange pressure began building in the air around them. It started as barely noticeable, like the feeling before a thunderstorm, but quickly intensified into something that made everyone on deck pause in their activities. What is that? Chopper asked, his fur standing on end. The pressure was coming from Luffy. It radiated outward in waves, growing stronger with each passing second. His conqueror's haki, but different somehow. Older, more refined. Carrying with it the weight of absolute authority that belonged to someone who had commanded not just crews, but entire fleets. Luffy, Nami said nervously, your haki is, I know. His voice was strange, distant. The journal had fallen open in his lap, and he was staring at the pages with an expression of growing recognition. I can feel it. The memories weren't coming in flashes anymore. They were flowing like a river that had burst its dam, decades of experiences flooding into his consciousness all at once. And with them came the emotions, the rage, the sorrow, the crushing weight of responsibility for thousands of lives. Standing on the deck of the Saber of Xebec, watching marine ships burn on the horizon. The satisfaction of victory, but also the hollow ache of knowing that every battle won was a step closer to the war that would consume everything. Holding the body of a child, maybe 8 years old, her name had been Maria, killed in a government raid on a D-clan settlement. The fury that had followed, white-hot and all-consuming. The decision that mercy was a luxury the dead couldn't afford. Planning the assault on Marijua itself. Sitting in a war room with the greatest pirates of the age, outlining a strategy that would topple the world government and expose their crimes to the world. The intoxicating rush of power, of being the axis around which history would turn. The final days, knowing that Roger and Garp were closing in, that the dream was dying. Writing letter after letter to crew members, trying to find words that would justify the choices he'd made, the people he'd failed to save. The last entry in the journal. The admission that he'd become the very thing he'd set out to destroy. The desperate hope that someone someday would finish what he'd started, but with love instead of hate, hope instead of fear. I remember, Luffy whispered, and his voice carried 4 decades of weight. I remember all of it. The Conqueror's haki erupted from him like a physical force, washing over the ship in waves that made the very air shimmer. But it wasn't just raw power, it was structured, controlled, carrying with it the unmistakable signature of the most dangerous pirate who had ever lived. His crew staggered under the pressure, not from its strength but from its familiarity. They'd felt this exact presence before in old stories and ancient legends. The haki of Rocks D. Xebec, the man who had made the world government tremble. Impossible, Brook breathed, his skeletal form shaking. That signature, I've heard the old sailors describe it. That's not just Conqueror's haki, that's the crown of tyranny, Robin finished, her voice barely audible over the thrumming power. The haki that could make marine admirals kneel. Luffy stood slowly, the journal still clutched in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes held a depth of knowledge and sorrow that belonged to someone far older than 17. Monkey D. Luffy, he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Third son of Monkey D. Dragon, grandson of Monkey D. Garp, captain of the Straw Hat Pirates. He paused, and when he continued, the words seemed to be torn from somewhere deep in his soul. And the reincarnation of Rocks D. Xebec, the man who declared war on the gods themselves. The admission hit the crew like a physical blow. Even though they'd suspected, even though the evidence had been mounting for days, hearing it stated so directly made it real in a way that left them reeling. How is that possible? Usopp stammered. The D-clan carries more than just a name, Luffy replied, and his voice held knowledge that came from sources beyond his own experience. We carry the will of ages past. Sometimes when the world needs it most, that will become strong enough to transcend death itself. But you're still you, right? Chopper asked in a small voice. "You're still our Luffy?" The question made him pause. He could feel both identities existing simultaneously in his mind. The carefree teenager who loved adventure and meat, and the ancient tyrant who had commanded fleets and toppled nations. They were distinct but intertwined, like two melodies playing in harmony. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I can feel both of us in here." He tapped his temple. "Luffy, who wants to be the pirate king and have fun with his friends. And Rox, who wants to tear down the world government and free the world from its chains. Those don't have to be contradictory goals," Robin observed quietly. "Don't they?" Luffy looked at her with eyes that held too much knowledge. Rox tried to free the world through fear and domination. He became the very thing he fought against. What happens if I start making the same choices? "You won't," Zoro said with absolute certainty. "How can you be sure?" "Because you're asking the question." Zoro stepped forward, his hand resting on Wado Ichimonji's hilt. Someone who was comfortable with becoming a tyrant wouldn't be worried about it. "Besides," Nami added, crossing her arms, "we've seen how you laid. You don't command through fear, you inspire through trust. That's not something that's going to change just because you have some old memories rattling around in your head." "Is it that simple?" Luffy asked, and for a moment he sounded like the uncertain teenager he actually was. "It is if you make it that simple," Sanji said, lighting a cigarette with hands that weren't quite steady. "Look, I don't pretend to understand all this reincarnation stuff, but I know you. I've sailed with you, fought beside you, watched you risk everything to save people you barely knew. That doesn't just disappear because you've got some ancient bastard's memories in your head. What if his goals become my goals? What if I start thinking his methods are justified? Then we'll knock some sense into you," Frankie declared. "That's what Nakama are for, right? Keeping each other on the right path." Luffy looked around at his crew, his family, and saw nothing but determination in their faces. They weren't afraid of him, despite knowing who he'd been in another life. They weren't planning to abandon him or turn him over to the Marines. They were planning to stand by him, just like they always had. "You guys are crazy," he said, but there was warmth in his voice for the first time in days. "Says the rubber man who's apparently the reincarnation of history's most dangerous pirate," Usopp pointed out with forced humor. The moment of levity was broken by the sound of footsteps on the deck. Everyone turned to see Jinbei approaching, his expression grave. "I felt your hockey from the other side of the ship," he said without preamble. "That signature. I've heard the old-timers describe it. You're really him, aren't you? The reincarnation of Rox Xebec." "Yeah," Luffy said simply. "I am." Jinbei nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting the confirmation. "Then you should know that this changes everything. The world government will stop at nothing to eliminate you once they realize what you are. Every Marine, every Cypher Paul agent, every resource they have will be focused on your destruction." "Let them come," Luffy said, and for a moment his voice carried the absolute confidence of someone who had once made the entire world tremble. "I'm not the same man I was before. I won't make his mistakes." "What will you do differently?" Robin asked. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of conviction that seemed to come from both of his identities. Rox tried to free the world by tearing it down and rebuilding it in his image. He thought he could use fear and violence to create something better. He turned to face his crew. "But you can't build a better world on a foundation of bodies. You can't inspire people to be free by making them afraid of you." "So what's your plan?" Zoro asked. "Same as it's always been, become the Pirate King, find the One Piece. But now," he smiled, and it was the first genuine smile they'd seen from him in days. "Now I know why those things matter. The One Piece isn't just treasure, it's the key to exposing the truth about the world government. And being Pirate King isn't just about being the strongest, it's about being free enough to protect the people who can't protect themselves." "That sounds like something both Luffy and Rox could agree on," Robin observed. "Exactly," he held up the journal, no longer afraid of what it contained. "I won't run from who I was, but I'll choose who I want to be. I'll use his knowledge, his experience, his understanding of how the world really works. But I'll do it my way, with friends instead of subordinates, with hope instead of fear, with trust instead of tyranny." The Conqueror's hockey that had been radiating from him began to change. It was still incredibly powerful, still carrying the authority of someone who had once commanded fleets. But now it also carried something else: warmth, compassion, the kind of strength that made people want to follow rather than forcing them to obey. "I am Monkey D. Luffy," he declared, his voice ringing across the deck with absolute certainty. "I will be the Pirate King. I will find the One Piece. I will expose the world government's lies and free the world from their chains." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of 2 lifetimes. And I'll do it all without becoming the monster that Xebec was afraid he'd become. His crew stood in stunned silence for a moment, processing everything they'd just heard. Then one by one, they began to smile. Well, Nami said finally, I guess we're really in it now. Were we ever not in it? Sanji asked with a laugh. Following this idiot was always going to end with us taking on the world government eventually. At least now we know why, Brook added cheerfully. Though I must say having a reincarnated tyrant for a captain does rather raise the stakes. Yo ho ho ho. Luffy, Chopper said seriously, tugging on his captain's pants leg. Promise us something. What? Promise that no matter what memories you get back, no matter how powerful you become, you'll always be our Luffy first. The request was simple, but it carried with it everything that mattered. Luffy knelt down so he was at eye level with his doctor, his expression soft with affection. I promise, Chopper, no matter what else I become, I'll always be your captain first. As the sun set over the Grand Line, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Straw Hat Pirates stood together on the deck of the Thousand Sunny. Their captain carried the memories of 2 lifetimes now, but he was still the same person who had gathered them all together through bonds of friendship and trust. The road ahead would be more dangerous than ever. The world government would come for them with everything they had. Ancient enemies would emerge from the shadows. The weight of inherited purpose would test every bond they'd forged. But for now, in this moment, they were complete. A crew of misfits and dreamers, led by a rubber-powered teenager who happened to be the reincarnation of history's most dangerous pirate. And somehow, that felt like exactly what the world needed. So, Luffy said, standing and stretching with his usual carefree attitude. Who's hungry? I'm starving. The normalcy of the question after everything they just discussed was so perfectly, absurdly Luffy that his entire crew burst into laughter. Some things, apparently, transcended even reincarnation. The cycle was beginning again, but this time, it would be different. This time, it would be guided by love instead of hate, and that perhaps would make all the difference. The first day after the revelation passed in a strange kind of normalcy that felt more fragile than glass. Everyone went through their usual routines. Sanji cooked, Nami navigated, Frankie maintained the ship, but there was a tension underneath it all, like they were all waiting for something to break. Luffy seemed more relaxed than he had in weeks, the weight of secrets finally lifted from his shoulders. He ate with his usual enthusiasm, laughed at Brook's terrible jokes, and even convinced Usopp to help him fish off the stern. To anyone watching from the outside, he looked exactly like the carefree captain they'd always known. But his crew was watching more carefully now, and they could see the differences. The way he stood when he thought no one was looking straighter, more commanding. The occasional flash of ancient knowledge in his eyes when discussing strategy or navigation. The subtle changes in his speech patterns, formal phrases slipping in among his usual casual language. It was still Luffy, but it was Luffy plus something else. And that something else had once been the most dangerous man in the world. Zoro was the first to reach his conclusion, which surprised no one. He'd always been the most straightforward member of the crew, the one who cut through complications with the brutal efficiency of a well-honed blade. He found Luffy on the second morning, sitting cross-legged on the Sunny's figurehead and staring out at the horizon with that distant expression that had become more common since Lodestar Island. You're still him, Zoro said without preamble, settling down beside his captain. Yeah, Luffy replied simply. I am. Good. Luffy blinked, surprised by the response. Good? You think I followed you all this time because you were weak? Zoro's mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile. I've always known you were going to change the world, Luffy. Now I just know how, even knowing who I used to be, what I did, what Rocks did, Zoro corrected firmly. You're not him, you're you with his memories, big difference. Is it? Zoro was quiet for a moment, watching seabirds wheel overhead. Remember back in Arabasta when Crocodile tried to convince you that being a hero was stupid, that helping people would just get you killed? Yeah. You told him that you didn't care about being a hero, you just did what you wanted to do. And what you wanted was to help Vivi save her country. Zoro turned to look at Luffy directly. That hasn't changed. You still do what you want to do, and what you want is still to help people. Everything else is just extra tools in the toolbox. Luffy stared at his first mate for a long moment, then broke into the first genuinely carefree grin he'd worn since Hachinosu. Thanks, Zoro. Don't mention it. Literally. If you tell anyone I gave you a pep talk, I'll cut you. Nami's approach was more practical, which also surprised no one. She cornered Luffy in the map room that afternoon, spreading charts across the table with brisk efficiency. All right, she said without preamble. If you're really the reincarnation of Rox D. Xebec, I need to know what that means for our finances. Luffy blinked. Our finances? Don't play dumb. Rox commanded the largest pirate fleet in history. He had to have hidden treasure caches, secret accounts, emergency funds. Where are they? The question triggered a flood of memories, strongholds on remote islands, coded accounts in underground banks, caches of gold and jewels buried in places only he knew about. Luffy rubbed his temples as the information settled into place. There are several locations, he said slowly. Hidden bases mostly, some of them might still be intact. Nami's eyes lit up with the particular gleam they got when she sensed money. How much are we talking about? Enough to buy a small country. Perfect. She began making notes with rapid efficiency. We'll need to verify which caches are still accessible, factor in inflation over 40 years, account for possible government seizures. She looked up at him with the kind of smile that usually preceded someone losing a lot of money. Consider this my way of saying I don't care if you're a reincarnated tyrant as long as you make us rich. Despite everything, Luffy found himself laughing. That's really what you're worried about. Money makes everything easier, Nami said pragmatically. Revolution, adventure, changing the world, it all costs money. If having Rock's memories means we can afford better supplies, better ships, better equipment, then I'm all for it. She paused in her note-taking to give him a more serious look. Besides, you're still the idiot who tried to give away 100 million berries because you thought it would make Vivi happy. Some things don't change, no matter what memories you gain. Usopp took longer to come around, which was entirely understandable given his natural inclination toward panic in the face of world-changing revelations. Luffy found him in his workshop on the evening of the second day, tinkering with ammunition but clearly not paying attention to what he was doing. Usopp, the sniper jumped so hard he nearly fell off his stool. Luffy, don't sneak up on me like that, my heart can't take it. Sorry, Luffy settled down on a nearby crate, careful not to disturb any of the delicate equipment. You've been avoiding me. I haven't been avoiding you, Usopp protested, then wilted under Luffy's steady gaze. Okay, maybe I've been avoiding you a little, but can you blame me? Do you know how terrifying it is to find out your captain is the reincarnation of the guy who made the world government wet themselves in fear? I'm still the same person, Usopp. Are you? Usopp turned to face him fully, and Luffy was surprised to see not fear in his eyes but genuine curiosity. I mean, you look the same, you act mostly the same, but sometimes you get this look like you're seeing things that aren't there, and your haki, he shuddered. Your haki feels like standing next to a volcano that might erupt at any moment. Luffy considered this. Does that scare you? Terrifies me, Usopp admitted. But you know what scares me more? The idea that you might leave us behind. What? Why would I? Because Rock's commanded fleets, Luffy. Dozens of crews, thousands of pirates. What if you decide that 8 people aren't enough anymore? What if you start thinking you need an army instead of a family? The question hit Luffy like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on not becoming Rock's darker aspects that he hadn't considered this particular fear. Usopp, he said quietly, do you remember what I told Kobe back in Shell's town? About what kind of pirate I wanted to be? You said you didn't want to be a hero because heroes share their meat and you wanted it all for yourself. Right. And do you remember what I told you when you wanted to leave at Water 7? Usopp's expression softened, that you couldn't become Pirate King without your sniper. I meant it then, and I mean it now. I don't want an army, Usopp. I want my crew, my family, the people who chose to follow me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Luffy leaned forward, his expression intense. Rocks might have commanded through fear, but I lead through friendship. That's never going to change. Usopp stared at him for a long moment, then broke into a watery smile. You know, for a reincarnated tyrant, you're still pretty sentimental. Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation. Sanji's reaction was the most complicated, which fit his nature perfectly. He found Luffy in the kitchen the next morning, sitting at the counter while Sanji prepared breakfast with his usual passionate precision. But there was tension in his movements, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. You want to ask me something, Luffy observed. Several somethings, Sanji admitted, not looking up from the eggs he was scrambling. But mostly, I need to know if you're still worth following. The bluntness of the question surprised them both. Sanji paused in his cooking, cigarette dangling from his lips, while Luffy processed what he'd just heard. You're questioning my leadership. I'm questioning whether the man I chose to follow still exists, Sanji clarified. See, I didn't sign up to serve under Rox D. Xebec. I signed up to cook for Monkey D. Luffy, the idiot who declared war on the world government to save one friend, who punched a celestial dragon for hurting people he barely knew, who would rather die than let his crew get hurt. He turned around, fixing Luffy with the kind of stare that could peel paint. So I need to know, are you still that person? Or are you slowly becoming someone who thinks the ends justify the means? Luffy met his gaze steadily. What do you think? I think, Sanji said slowly, that you're still the kind of person who asks your cook what he thinks instead of just ordering him to shut up and follow. He took a long drag of his cigarette. Rox wouldn't have cared about my opinion. No, Luffy agreed, he wouldn't have. So I guess that's my answer. Sanji turned back to his cooking with a shrug that was perhaps a little too casual. You're still an idiot who cares too much about people he barely knows. The memories are just additional context. That's it, that's it. Sanji plated the eggs with artistic precision. Though I reserve the right to kick your ass if you start acting too much like an overlord. Fair enough. Chopper's acceptance came in the form of a medical examination that was both thorough and slightly absurd. Stick out your tongue, he ordered, wielding a small flashlight with professional authority. I need to check for signs of personality degradation. I don't think that's how personality degradation works, Chopper. Hey, I'm the doctor here, now say ah. Luffy submitted to the examination with good humor, allowing Chopper to check his reflexes, test his memory, and even examine his hockey patterns with medical instruments that definitely weren't designed for that purpose. Conclusion, Chopper announced after 20 minutes of poking and prodding. You're still Luffy, maybe a little more serious sometimes, and your hockey signature is way scarier than it used to be, but fundamentally unchanged. That's your medical opinion. That's my medical opinion, Chopper confirmed solemnly. Then his expression brightened. Besides, you still pet me the same way you always have. Evil overlords probably don't give good head scratches. Probably not, Luffy agreed, obligingly scratching behind Chopper's antlers. Brook approached the situation with the perspective of someone who had lived through multiple lifetimes himself. Memories are strange things, he mused, sitting beside Luffy on the deck as the sun set on their third day of sailing. I carry the memories of my original crew, all of whom died decades before I met any of you. Sometimes I catch myself expecting to see faces that are long gone. Do you ever feel like you're betraying them? By caring about new people? At first, Brook admitted. But then I realized that the dead don't want to chain the living to their memory. They want us to keep moving forward, keep making new bonds, keep finding reasons to smile. He turned his hollow eye sockets toward Luffy. I imagine Rox Xebec, whatever his faults, would want the same thing. Even if it means I do things differently than he did. Especially then. Brook began to tune his violin, the familiar ritual somehow comforting. After all, his methods didn't work out so well for him, did they? Perhaps a different approach is exactly what the world needs. The simple wisdom of it made Luffy smile. Thanks, Brook. Think nothing of it. Though I must say, having a reincarnated captain does make for interesting dinner conversation. Yo-ho-ho-ho. Robin's approach was, predictably, the most analytical. She found Luffy in the library that evening, surrounded by books about reincarnation, inherited will, and the mysterious nature of the D-clan. Her research had been thorough, as always. I've been thinking about the implications, she said without preamble. Of course you have. If you truly are Rox reincarnated, it raises interesting questions about the nature of inherited will in the D-clan. Are all D's reincarnations of previous D's? Is this why the world government fears the clan so much? Luffy considered this. The memories of Rox included fragments of knowledge about other D. Clan members, hints of connections that transcended individual lifetimes. I don't think we're all reincarnations, he said slowly, but I think we're all connected somehow. Like we're all part of the same story, just told across different generations. A story about what? Freedom. The word came out with absolute certainty. The D. Clan exists to oppose tyranny, to fight for freedom, to make sure the powerful can't crush the weak without consequence. Some of us do it through adventure, some through revolution, some through simply refusing to bow down. Robin nodded, her historian's mind filing away this information for later analysis. And you, how will you do it? By being Pirate King, by finding the One Piece, by exposing the truth about the world government. He looked at her directly. Same way I always plan to, just with better understanding of why it matters. And us. Your crew, you're the most important part, Luffy said simply. Rox tried to change the world alone with subordinates instead of friends. He failed because he forgot that real strength comes from the bonds we choose to make. Robin smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. Then I think we'll be just fine. Jinbei's conversation was the briefest, but perhaps the most meaningful. He found Luffy at the bow of the ship, staring out at the stars with the kind of expression that suggested he was seeing more than just the night sky. "Regrets?" Jinbei asked simply. "About the reincarnation thing? No, about some of the things he did." Luffy was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, a lot of regrets." Good, good. A leader who doesn't regret their mistakes is a leader who will repeat them," Jinbei said with the wisdom of someone who had served under multiple captains over his long life. "The fact that you can feel guilt for actions you didn't personally commit tells me everything I need to know about the kind of captain you still are." He placed a webbed hand on Luffy's shoulder, the gesture carrying the weight of absolute loyalty. "I followed you because I believed you could change the world for the better. That hasn't changed, no matter whose memories you carry." Frankie's acceptance was typically dramatic and involved several explosions. "Super," he shouted, striking his signature pose while fireworks went off behind him. "Our captain is the reincarnation of the world's most dangerous pirate. That's super awesome." "You're not worried?" Luffy asked, ducking a stray sparkler. "Worried? Bro, this is the best news ever. Do you know how cool it is to serve under someone with that kind of legendary status? My modifications to the Sunny are going to be legendary too." "Super legendary? Frankie, I used to be a tyrant who ruled through fear and violence." "Used to be," Frankie pointed out, adjusting his sunglasses. "Key words there, little bro. You're not him anymore, you're you." "And you is super?" The simple, uncomplicated acceptance was somehow exactly what Luffy needed to hear. The crew meeting happened on the fourth day, not because anyone planned it, but because they all seemed to arrive at the same conclusion simultaneously. They gathered on deck after dinner, the familiar ritual of evening conversation taking on new weight. "All right," Nami said, taking charge with her usual efficiency. "I think we all need to talk about this situation openly. No more dancing around it, no more pretending everything is normal." "Everything is normal," Zoro pointed out, "just with additional context." "Additional context that includes our captain being the reincarnation of history's most dangerous pirate," Usopp added. "That seems like the kind of thing that changes the whole dynamic of the crew." "Does it?" Luffy asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a moment. Then one by one, his crew began to shake their heads. "You're still the guy who declared war on the world government to save Robin," Sanji said. "Still the guy who punched a celestial dragon because he hurt my friend," Chopper added. "Still the guy who trusted me with his dream even when everyone else said I was a demon," Robin continued. "Still the guy who brought me back to life, even though I'm already dead," Yo-ho-ho-ho, Brook chimed in. "Still the guy who accepted me even though I was a former Shichibukai," Jinbei said solemnly. "Still the guy whose ship I'm proud to modify with super technology," Frankie declared. "Still the guy who never gave up on bringing me back to the crew," Usopp said quietly. "Still the guy who convinced me my dream was worth pursuing," Nami finished. Luffy looked around at his crew, his family, and felt something tight in his chest finally loosen. These weren't people who followed him out of fear or obligation. These were people who had chosen him, who continued to choose him, even knowing the truth about his past life. "So what's the verdict?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. "Same as it's always been," Zoro said firmly. "You're our captain, we're your crew, everything else is just noise. Even if I start making decisions based on Rock's memories." "Especially then," Nami said. "Because that's when you'll need us most, to make sure you remember who you chose to be, not just who you used to be." "We're not just your crew, Luffy," Robin added gently. "We're your conscience, your anchor to the present. The people who will remind you that some prices are too high to pay, no matter how noble the goal." Luffy felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for the people who had chosen to stand by him. "You guys are the best," he said simply. "Damn right we are," Nami replied with a grin. "Now about those hidden treasure caches you mentioned." The laughter that followed was genuine and warm, cutting through the tension that had been building for days. They were the Straw Hat Pirates, and they would face whatever came next the way they always had together. As the evening wore on and the conversation drifted to lighter topics, Luffy found himself watching his crew with new appreciation. Rox had commanded through fear and respect. He had followers, subordinates, people who obeyed him because they had to. But Luffy had something Rox never had: people who chose to follow him because they loved him, who would stand by him not out of duty but out of friendship. That was a power no amount of Conqueror's haki could match. The cycle was beginning again, but this time it would be different. This time, it would be guided by bonds that even death couldn't break. And that, Luffy realized with perfect clarity, was exactly how it should be. The attack came without warning, which was itself a warning. Charlotte Linlin didn't announce herself with cannon fire or demanding surrender. She simply appeared on their port side like a force of nature made manifest. Her ship, the Queen Mama Chant, materializing out of what had seemed like empty ocean with the kind of stealth that shouldn't have been possible for something that massive. Impossible, Nami breathed, staring at her instruments in confusion. She wasn't there 5 minutes ago. How did she? She knows these waters, Luffy said quietly, his voice carrying knowledge that came from borrowed memory. There's a thermal layer about 3 miles down that can hide even large ships if you know how to use it right. The crew turned to stare at him, but before anyone could ask how he knew that, Big Mom's voice boomed across the water with all the subtlety of a natural disaster. Straw Hat, the sound carried more than just volume, it carried Conqueror's hockey, but not the kind meant to dominate. This was something else, something that felt almost nostalgic. Like she was testing for a specific response rather than trying to crush their will. Luffy felt the answer rise from somewhere deep in his borrowed memories. Without conscious thought, he stepped to the Sunny's railing and released his own hockey in reply, not the chaotic burst of power his crew was used to, but something older, more refined. A pattern that carried authority and recognition in equal measure. The effect on Big Mom was immediate and visible even from a distance. She straightened on her ship's deck, her enormous frame going rigid with something that might have been shock. Impossible, she whispered, but her voice still carried across the water. That's signature. It can't be. Hello, Linlin, Luffy called back, and his voice carried decades of familiarity that made his own crew do a double take. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either celebration or catastrophe. Then Big Mom began to laugh, not her usual unhinged cackle, but something deeper, warmer, tinged with genuine emotion. I knew it. I knew you weren't really gone, she gestured to her crew, and the Queen Mama Chant began moving closer with surprising delicacy. 40 years I've been waiting for you to come back, Captain. I'm not your captain anymore, Linlin. Aren't you? She was close enough now that they could see her clearly, all 28 feet of her, but somehow seeming smaller than usual. Vulnerable almost. You have his memories, don't you? His knowledge, his. She paused, studying his face with eyes that held decades of pain. His regrets, Luffy nodded slowly. Yeah, I do. Then you remember what you promised me. What you promised all of us. The memory hit him like a physical blow, so vivid it made him stagger. A young Charlotte Linlin, maybe 16, sitting alone in the ruins of what had been her home. Bodies scattered around her, not enemies, but the people she'd been trying to protect. Her own strength had betrayed her again, turned her into the monster everyone said she was. I didn't mean to, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I was trying to save them. I know. His voice, but older, gentler than it had any right to be given his reputation. Strength without control is just destruction. But strength with purpose, that can save the world. Who would follow someone like me? I'm a monster. You're my daughter now, and I protect my family no matter what the world thinks of them. Luffy shook his head, trying to separate the memory from his current reality. Linlin, I'm not him, I'm not Rocks. No, she gestured, and several of her children grown adults now, but Luffy could see the younger versions in his borrowed memories, arranged a gangplank between the ships. Then prove it. Before his crew could object, Big Mom stepped across the gangplank with surprising grace for someone her size. The Sunny's deck creaked ominously under her weight, but Frankie's modifications held firm. Standing this close to her, Luffy could see things his crew couldn't. The way she held herself, slightly hunched as if expecting a blow. The careful distance she maintained, despite her bold words. The hands that trembled just slightly, betraying nerves that Charlotte Linlin wasn't supposed to possess. You're afraid, he realized. Afraid. The Yonko Big Mom doesn't fear anything. Charlotte Linlin is terrified that I'll reject her the way everyone else always has. The laughter died in her throat. For a moment, the fearsome Emperor of the Sea looked exactly like the abandoned 16-year-old from his memories. You left us, she said quietly, and the pain in her voice was devastating. You promised you'd always protect the family, and then you went and got yourself killed. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. The words came out as a roar that made the ship's timbers groan. You could have run, you could have hidden. You could have lived, not while innocent people were dying, not while the government was committing genocide in the shadows. Luffy's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Some things are worth dying for, and some things are worth living for. Big Mom grabbed him by the shoulders, her massive hands surprisingly gentle. Your crew, your family, the people who needed you. I failed them. I failed you. The admission tore from his throat like it was taking pieces of him with it. I let my anger make me into the thing I was fighting against. I became a tyrant who ruled through fear instead of a leader who inspired through love. You were trying to save the world. I was trying to burn it down and rebuild it in my image. There's a difference. Big Mom stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she found there made her release his shoulders and step back. You really aren't him, are you? You remember everything, but you're not him. I'm Monkey D. Luffy. I just happen to remember being someone else. And what does Monkey D. Luffy want to do about the world government's crimes? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Luffy was aware of his crew watching, waiting to see how he would answer. This was the test, he realized, not of his power or his knowledge, but of his character. I want to expose their lies, he said finally. I want the world to know the truth about the genocide, about the cover-ups, about all of it. But I won't become them to do it. I won't rule through fear or sacrifice innocent people for the greater good. That's not how the world works, Big Mom said with the tired wisdom of someone who'd spent decades learning hard lessons. Nice dreams don't defeat governments. Pretty speeches don't stop genocide. Sometimes you have to be the monster to fight monsters. No, the word came out with absolute finality. That's what Rox thought, and look how it ended. The moment you become the thing you're fighting, you've already lost. Then how do you plan to change anything? Luffy looked around at his crew, drawing strength from their presence. With friends instead of subjects. With trust instead of fear. With hope instead of rage. Big Mom followed his gaze, taking in the Straw Hat Pirates for the first time. Her expression was unreadable as she studied each face. These are your crew, these are my family. They don't fear you. Why would they? I'm not their emperor, I'm their captain. There's a difference. Is there? Big Mom's voice carried genuine curiosity now. Show me. Before Luffy could ask what she meant, she moved with speed that belied her massive frame. Her fist, crackling with armament hockey and soul-powered flame, came down toward Chopper with enough force to crater the deck. Luffy was there before the blow could land, his own fist meeting hers with a clash that sent shockwaves across the water. But he wasn't using just his Gear 4th techniques. There was something older in his movements, more refined. Hockey patterns that belonged to someone who had fought the strongest opponents of a previous generation. Interesting, Big Mom purred, pressing her attack. You fight differently now, more experienced. She wasn't wrong. Luffy found himself moving with knowledge he'd never acquired, anticipating attacks through pattern recognition that came from decades of combat experience. When she threw a left hook enhanced with Conqueror's Haki, he didn't just dodge, he redirected the force, using her own momentum against her in a way that would have taken years to master. I had a good teacher, he admitted, launching a counterattack that combined his rubber powers with techniques from an older era. The brief exchange was more test than battle, both fighters probing the other's abilities and resolve. But when it ended with both fighters stepping back, neither having gained a clear advantage, Big Mom was smiling. Yes, that's more like it. She turned to address his crew directly. You follow him willingly. Of course we do, Zoro replied, hand still on his sword but not drawing it. He's our captain. Even knowing who he used to be, what he was capable of. Especially then, Nami said firmly. Anyone can follow someone who's perfect. It takes real loyalty to stand by someone who's struggling with their demons. Big Mom's expression shifted, becoming something softer and more complex. I see, and you, Straw Hat. What do your demons tell you to do about me? The question was loaded with decades of history. Luffy could remember training sessions where he'd tried to help her control her strength. Family dinners where she'd laughed at his terrible jokes. The pride he'd felt watching her grow from a scared child into one of the strongest people in the world. He could also remember the disappointment when she'd started building her own kingdom through fear and coercion. The arguments about methods and goals, the gradual drift apart as she embraced the very tactics he'd been trying to teach her to avoid. They tell me you became everything I was afraid you'd become, he said honestly. But they also tell me it's not too late to choose a different path. I'm a Yonko Straw Hat. I have an empire, responsibilities, people depending on me. I can't just change my methods overnight. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that there might be better ways to protect your family than ruling through terror. Big Mom was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than her crew had heard it in decades. Do you remember what you told me the last time we spoke? Before God Valley, Luffy closed his eyes, letting the memory surface. Standing on the deck of the Saber of Xebec, watching the first reports come in about government forces gathering. The knowledge that this would be the final battle, that everything was about to end. Linlin, if something happens to me, promise me something. Nothing's going to happen to you, Captain. You're too stubborn to die. Promise me anyway. Promise me you'll remember that strength isn't just about being feared. Real strength is about being someone worth following, not because people have to, but because they want to. I promise, Captain. You promised you'd remember that real strength comes from being worth following, not from being feared, Luffy said quietly. Big Mom's eyes filled with tears, actual tears, something her children hadn't seen since they were very young. I broke that promise, she whispered. Promises can be kept again, can they? After all the things I've done, all the people I've hurt, everyone deserves a chance to choose who they want to be, even Yonko. For a moment, it looked like she might break down completely. Then she straightened, wiping her eyes with the back of her massive hand. You really aren't him, she said with something that might have been relief. Rox would have tried to recruit me or demanded I submit to his authority. You're offering me, what? Friendship? I'm offering you the chance to be part of something better than fear and empire. To be part of a family that chooses to stay together instead of one held together by terror. And if I say no, then you say no. I won't force you, Linlin, that's not who I am. Big Mom stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she began to laugh, not her usual manic cackle, but something warmer, more genuine. M-A-M-A-M-A-M-A. You really are an idealistic fool, aren't you? Just like he was underneath all that darkness. Is that a yes or a no? It's a maybe. I need time to think about what you've said. Time to figure out if an old monster can learn new tricks. She began moving toward the gangplank, then paused. But Straw Hat, the others won't be as understanding as I am, Kaido especially. He won't see you as his captain's reincarnation. He'll see you as an insult to his memory. Let him come. He will, and when he does, she looked back at him one final time. Try to remember that some of us became monsters to survive in a world that gave us no choice. Don't judge us too harshly for the choices we made when we were scared children who just wanted to belong somewhere. With that, she crossed back to her own ship, leaving the Straw Hats alone on their deck with the weight of everything that had just transpired. Well, Brooke said finally, that was significantly less violent than I expected, though I must say family reunions are always so dramatic. Yo ho ho ho. That wasn't a reunion, Robin corrected. That was a job interview. A job interview? Usopp squeaked. Big Mom was testing whether Luffy had changed enough to be worth following again, or if he was just rocks in a different body. And, Nami asked. And I think we passed, Luffy said quietly, watching the Queen Mama chant disappear into the distance. But she's right about the others. They won't all be as willing to listen. Bring them on, Zoro said with anticipation. I've been wondering what it would be like to fight a Yonko at full strength. Be careful what you wish for, Jinbei warned. If Kaido comes looking for a fight, he won't be interested in conversation first. As the day wore on and the crew processed what had happened, Luffy found himself standing at the bow of the ship, staring at the horizon where Big Mom's ship had vanished. The encounter had been emotionally exhausting, forcing him to confront not just Rock's memories but his own feelings about them. She'd been right about one thing: some of Rock's former crew members had become monsters not out of choice, but out of necessity. They'd been children when he found them, broken and abandoned, looking for someone strong enough to protect them from a world that saw them as threats. He'd given them that protection, but he'd also failed to give them something more important: hope. Hope that the world could be better, that they could be more than just weapons in his war against the government. That was the difference, Luffy realized. Rox had seen his crew as weapons to be wielded in service of a greater cause. But Luffy saw his crew as people to be protected and cherished, regardless of any greater purpose. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe choosing love over fear, hope over rage, would make all the difference this time around. Or maybe Big Mom was right, and the world was too cruel for idealistic dreams. Either way, Luffy was committed to finding out. As the sun set over the Grand Line, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Straw Hat Pirates sailed on toward whatever challenges awaited them. Behind them, the ghost of their encounter with Big Mom lingered like an unresolved chord, while ahead of them, the promise of future confrontations grew stronger with each passing mile. The cycle was turning, old relationships were being tested and reformed, and somewhere in the distance, other members of the legendary Rocks Pirates were beginning to take notice of their former captain's return. The question wasn't whether they would come. The question was whether Monkey D. Luffy would be strong enough to face them when they did. The storm came from the east, black clouds boiling across the sky with unnatural speed. But it wasn't the weather that made the crew of the Thousand Sunny go silent with dread, it was what rode within those clouds. That's not possible, Nami whispered, staring at her weather instruments in disbelief. Storms don't move like that, they don't have intent. But this one did. The massive thunderhead seemed to pulse with malevolent purpose, lightning crackling in patterns that looked almost deliberate. And within that chaos of wind and electricity, something vast and serpentine twisted through the air with predatory grace. Kaido, Luffy said quietly, his voice carrying knowledge that came from borrowed nightmares. The name hit his crew like a physical blow. They'd heard the stories, the emperor who couldn't die, the beast who had conquered Wano through sheer, overwhelming force. The man who was said to be the strongest creature alive. Here, Usopp's voice cracked on the word. Now, but we're not ready. We need a plan, we need. His panic was cut short by a sound that seemed to come from the storm itself, a roar that shook the ocean and sent seabirds fleeing in all directions. It wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal, but something caught between the two that spoke of barely contained rage. The dragon that emerged from the clouds was everything the legends said and worse. Azure scales that gleamed like polished steel, eyes like burning coals, whiskers that crackled with elemental power. It was beautiful in the way that avalanches were beautiful, majestic, terrible, and absolutely lethal. Kaido circled the Sunny twice before landing on the water nearby, his massive form somehow staying afloat despite physics suggesting otherwise. When he transformed back into his human-beast hybrid form, the displacement sent waves rolling toward their ship. "Straw Hat Luffy," he rumbled, his voice carrying decades of accumulated fury. "So you're the one pretending to be my captain." "I'm not pretending anything," Luffy replied, stepping to the ship's railing. "I am who I am." "Are you?" Kaido's club materialized in his hands, crackling with Conqueror's haki. "Because the reports I've been hearing suggest you've been using techniques that belong to a dead man, fighting with strategies that Rocks D. Xebec used to use. Maybe because I remember using them." WRORORO, Kaido's laughter was like thunder, equal parts amusement and rage. "Remember, you think you can claim his legacy just because you've got some borrowed memories rattling around in your skull." The massive club came down toward Luffy's head with enough force to split the ocean itself. But Luffy was already moving, launching himself into the air with a gum-gum rocket that carried him clear of the devastating blow. "I'm not claiming anything," Luffy shouted as he spun in midair, preparing his own attack. "I am Rocks D. Xebec reincarnated in a new body. Gum-gum, Red Hawk." The flaming punch that followed wasn't just his usual technique. There was something older woven into it, a pattern of haki application that belonged to a previous generation. When it connected with Kaido's guard, the impact sent shockwaves across the water, but Kaido barely flinched. Instead, his eyes widened with something that might have been recognition. "That stance," he growled. "That technique. It really is you, isn't it? I told you, you told me nothing." The roar that followed was devastating, carrying enough Conqueror's haki to crack the Sunny's mast. 40 years I've been waiting for you to come back. 40 years of watching this world grow weak and soft and pathetic." His club swung in a wide arc, trailing electricity and dark haki. Luffy dodged, but barely. The weapon passed close enough to singe his hat. "And this is how you return," Kaido's voice dripped with disgust. "In the body of some rubber brat surrounded by weaklings preaching about friendship and cooperation, you've gone soft, Captain. I've grown wiser. You've grown weak." Another devastating swing, this one aimed at the Sunny itself. Luffy intercepted it with both hands, his body stretching to absorb the impact, but the force still sent him skidding backward across the deck. The Rocks I knew would have conquered Wano in a day. He would have crushed the world government by now. He would have claimed his place as king of the world instead of playing pirate with children. Luffy straightened, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "The Rocks you knew failed, Kaido. He died alone on a beach, having accomplished nothing except making the world more afraid of him." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Kaido's expression shifted from rage to something more complex: pain, betrayal, the kind of hurt that comes from having your deepest beliefs challenged. "He died fighting," Kaido said quietly. "He died trying to change the world. He died because he forgot that you can't change the world alone, because he thought fear was stronger than trust." Luffy activated Gear 4th, his body inflating and darkening with armament haki. "I won't make that mistake. Bounty Man." The punch that followed carried not just Luffy's current power, but techniques refined over decades of combat. It was Rock's precision combined with Luffy's determination, creating something entirely new. But Kaido was ready for it. His club met Luffy's fist in a clash that split the sky itself, Conqueror's haki crackling between them in visible streams of black lightning. "You want to know what your mistake was, Captain?" Kaido pushed forward, his strength seeming limitless. You cared too much about people who were too weak to matter. They all matter, Luffy pushed back, their clash sending waves of force across the ocean. Every single person matters. Pretty words. Kaido's other hand came up, grabbing Luffy by the throat. But words don't stop genocide, words don't topple governments. Only power matters and you've forgotten how to use it. He hurled Luffy toward the Sunny with crushing force, but the rubber man twisted in midair, redirecting his trajectory to land safely on deck. His crew immediately moved to support him, but he held up a hand. This is my fight. Like hell it is, Zoro growled, drawing his swords. You're our captain, that makes it our fight too. The swordsman has spine, Kaido observed with something approaching approval. More than I can say for most of these seas, but he's still weak. Am I? Zoro's response was to launch himself directly at the Emperor, his three-sword style creating a whirlwind of cutting force. Kaido caught all three blades on his club, but Zoro's attack had created an opening. Sanji came from the other side, his leg blazing with Diablo Jambé fire. Jinbei followed with a water-enhanced punch that could shatter stone. This is what I mean, Luffy called out as he rejoined the battle. Rox fought alone because he thought he was the only one strong enough to matter. But strength isn't just about individual power. His crew moved around him like parts of a single organism, each fighter covering the other's weaknesses, creating combinations that were greater than the sum of their parts. When Kaido swung his club at Robin, Frankie's radical beam forced him to dodge. When he tried to grab Usopp, Nami's lightning made him hesitate just long enough for Brook's ice to freeze his feet. Pack tactics, Kaido sneered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Weak creatures huddling together for warmth. Family, Luffy corrected, launching another Red Hawk that forced Kaido to block instead of counterattacking. People who choose to stand together because they believe in the same dream. Dreams don't win wars, they do if enough people share them. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Grand Line had seen in decades. Kaido was everything his reputation claimed: impossibly strong, nearly indestructible, wielding power that could reshape islands. But he was fighting not just Luffy, but the entire Straw Hat crew working in perfect harmony. And slowly, impossibly, they were gaining ground. Impossible, Kaido gasped as another coordinated assault forced him to give up territory. You're just children, weaklings. You shouldn't be able to. This is what you never understood, Luffy said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. Power shared is power multiplied. Trust given creates trust received. Love inspires people to fight harder than fear ever could. He could feel it happening, the perfect fusion of his two identities. Rock's strategic mind and decades of combat experience, combined with Luffy's natural charisma and unshakable belief in his friends. For the first time since the memories had begun surfacing, he felt complete. Gum Gum King Kong Gun, the massive fist that emerged from his transformation, was enhanced not just by his devil fruit power, but by Haki techniques that belonged to a previous age. When it connected with Kaido's guard, the impact created a crater in the ocean itself. But more than that, it carried something Kaido hadn't felt in 40 years: the absolute authority of Rock's D. Xebec, refined by Luffy's compassionate heart into something entirely new. Kaido staggered backward, his eyes wide with something that might have been recognition. That power, he whispered, that presence, you really are him, but different. Changed? I'm both of us, Luffy said simply, his gear fourth form radiating power that made the air itself shimmer. I'm the man who remembered that strength without compassion is just destruction, and the boy who learned that compassion without strength is just wishful thinking. For a moment, it looked like Kaido might continue the fight. His grip tightened on his club, his muscles tensed for another attack, but then something in his expression shifted, the fury fading into something more complex. You were supposed to be eternal, he said quietly. Unchanging. The one constant in a world that kept disappointing me. People change, Kaido, even across lifetimes. And what if I don't want to change? What if I like being feared? What if I prefer strength to weakness? Then that's your choice. But don't pretend it's the only choice or the right one. Kaido stared at him for a long moment, then began to laugh, not his usual boisterous roar, but something quieter, more thoughtful. Woraro. You really have changed, haven't you? The old captain would have tried to beat the defiance out of me, make me submit through superior force. I'm not interested in making you submit. I'm interested in making you think. Think about what? About whether the world you're trying to create through fear and domination is really the world you want to live in. About whether ruling through terror actually makes you strong, or just makes everyone else afraid to show their own strength. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Kaido's expression was unreadable as he processed what he'd just heard. Finally, he straightened, his club dissolving back into whatever mystical space it came from. "I'm not ready to hear this," he said simply. "Maybe I never will be." But he looked directly at Luffy, and for just a moment the Emperor of Beasts looked like the scared young man Rox had once taken under his wing. "But maybe you're not completely wrong either. That's all I can ask for. Don't mistake this for weakness, Straw Hat. If we meet again, I'll still try to kill you. That's just who I am. I know, and I'll try to stop you because that's who I am." Kaido nodded, something approaching respect flickering in his eyes. "You might be worthy of that name after all." "We'll see." He began to transform back into his dragon form, scales rippling across his massive frame, but before he took to the sky, he paused. For what it's worth. He would have been proud of what you're trying to do, even if he would have disagreed with your methods. "I know," Luffy said quietly. "I can feel it." With that, Kaido launched himself into the storm clouds, his serpentine form disappearing into the darkness he'd emerged from. Within minutes, the unnatural weather began to dissipate, leaving the Straw Hats alone on calm seas. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone seemed to be processing what they'd just witnessed, not just the battle itself, but what it represented. "That was," Usopp started, then trailed off, apparently unable to find words. "Incredible," Robin finished. "You fought him to a standstill, a Yonko." "We fought him to a standstill," Luffy corrected, deflating back to his normal size. "All of us together? Is that what made the difference?" Nami asked. "Teamwork. That, and remembering that strength isn't just about how much damage you can do." Luffy looked around at his crew, his family, with an expression of profound gratitude. "It's about having people worth fighting for." "Very philosophical," Zoro observed. "Though I notice you didn't mention the part where you were channeling techniques from 40 years ago." Luffy nodded slowly. "For the first time since this all started, I felt like both of them were working together instead of fighting each other. Like I found a way to be both Monkey D. Luffy and Rox D. Xebec without losing either one." "And how does that feel?" Chopper asked with professional curiosity. "Complete," Luffy admitted. "Like I finally understand what I'm supposed to be doing with these memories. Which is, finishing what Rox started but doing it right this time. Exposing the world government's crimes, freeing the people they've oppressed, creating a world where strength serves compassion instead of the other way around." He looked out at the horizon where Kaido had disappeared, his expression thoughtful. "Big Mom might be ready to listen to reason. Kaido's going to take more convincing, but they're both still the people Rox tried to protect all those years ago. Under all that power and fear and anger, they're still the scared children who just wanted someone strong enough to keep them safe." "And you think you can reach that part of them?" Jinbei asked. "I think I have to try. Because if I can't," Luffy's voice carried the weight of terrible possibility. "If I can't show them there's a better way, then I'll have to stop them the way the world government stopped Rox. And that's not a world I want to create." The crew fell silent, contemplating the magnitude of what their captain was attempting. Not just becoming Pirate King, but reforming the most dangerous people in the world through the power of example and compassion. "Well," Frankie said finally, "when you put it like that, it sounds super impossible." "Good thing impossible is our specialty," Nami added with a grin that was only slightly forced. As the day wore on and they sailed away from the site of their confrontation with Kaido, Luffy found himself thinking about the conversation with his former subordinate. The pain in Kaido's eyes when he'd talked about waiting 40 years for Rox to return. The disappointment when he'd found someone different from what he'd expected. They'd all been damaged by Rox's death, Luffy realized. Not just because they'd lost a protector, but because they'd lost the one person who had ever made them feel like they belonged somewhere. In response, they'd each built their own empires, their own families, their own ways of ensuring they'd never be abandoned again. But they'd built them on foundations of fear, because that was the only model they'd known. Rox had protected them, but he'd also taught them that strength was the only currency that mattered in a cruel world. Now Luffy had to show them something different. Had to prove that trust was stronger than fear, that love could accomplish what hate never could, that there was another way to be strong. It wouldn't be easy, it might not even be possible. But as he looked around at his crew, people who had chosen to follow him not because they had to, but because they wanted to, Luffy felt something that Rox had never known in his final days. Hope. The cycle was turning, old wounds were being reopened, and the ghosts of the past were demanding their due. But this time, the outcome would be different. This time, strength would serve love instead of the other way around. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to change everything. The first sign that everything had changed came in the form of Morgans himself. The massive albatross descended from the sky like a force of nature, his camera crews trailing behind him in a formation that suggested this wasn't just a routine news-gathering operation. When he landed on the Thousand Sunnies deck, his eyes held the kind of gleam that journalists got when they sensed a story that would reshape the world. "Straw Hat Luffy," he declared, striking a dramatic pose. "Or should I say, Rocks D." Xebec, the crew tensed immediately, hands moving to weapons, but Luffy held up a hand to stop them. "How did you find out?" Big news indeed." Morgans began pacing the deck with manic energy. "My sources in the underground have been buzzing for days about strange encounters. Charlotte Linlin acting, subdued after meeting your crew, Kaido engaging in philosophical debates instead of his usual mindless destruction. And the hockey signatures." He pulled out a specialized device that looked like a cross between a den-den-mushi and a seismograph. "Conqueror's hockey leaves traces, patterns unique to each individual. And yours, my dear Straw Hat, matches records from 40 years ago." Robin stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. "What exactly do you want, Morgans?" "Want? My dear archaeologist, I want to change the world." The bird's eyes practically glowed with excitement. "Do you have any idea what this story represents? The return of the most dangerous man who ever lived, reincarnated in the body of the next pirate king. This isn't just news, this is legend in the making. And if we refuse to give you an interview," Zoro's hand rested on his sword hilt, the threat clear. "Oh, but you misunderstand." Morgans laughed with genuine amusement. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you the greatest gift a journalist can give, the chance to tell your own story." He gestured grandly, his wings spread wide. "The world government will spin this however serves their purposes. They'll paint you as a monster, a threat, the resurrection of their greatest enemy. But I can give you something they can't, the truth. Your truth, told in your own words." Luffy was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected opportunity. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we do this my way." The interview that followed would become the most widely distributed piece of journalism in the history of the World Economic Newspaper. Morgan's cameras captured everything: Luffy's earnest explanations of his reincarnated memories, the crew's unwavering loyalty despite knowing who he'd been, the genuine emotion as he talked about wanting to finish what Rocks had started, but do it right this time. "So you don't deny being Rocks D. Xebec reincarnated?" Morgans pressed. "Why would I deny it? It's the truth." Luffy's response was characteristically straightforward. "I am Monkey D. Luffy, and I am also the reincarnation of Rocks D. Xebec. Both things can be true at the same time. And what does this mean for your goals, your crew, your future as Pirate King?" Luffy looked directly into the camera, his expression serious in a way that had become more common since his awakening. "It means I understand now what the One Piece really is, why Roger laughed when he found it, why becoming Pirate King matters beyond just being the strongest. Enlighten us. The world government has been lying to everyone for centuries. They've committed genocide, covered up atrocities, painted themselves as heroes while they murder innocent people. The One Piece isn't just treasure, it's the key to exposing their crimes. And being Pirate King isn't just about freedom, it's about having the platform to tell the world the truth." Morgan's eyes gleamed. "And you believe you can succeed where Rocks D. Xebec failed? I know I can. Because I'm not doing it alone, and I'm not doing it through fear." Luffy gestured to his crew, who stood around him with expressions of absolute determination. Rocks tried to change the world by tearing it down and rebuilding it in his image. But you can't build something better on a foundation of bodies. Real change comes from giving people hope, not making them afraid. The interview went on for hours, covering everything from his earliest memories of Rock's life to his plans for exposing the world government's crimes. By the time it was over, Morgans was practically vibrating with excitement. "This will be on every newsstand, every den-den-mushi broadcast, every underground information network within days," he promised. "The world will know the truth that Rocks D. Xebec has returned but changed, evolved, become something the world government should fear far more than the original." "Why?" Robin asked. "What makes this version more dangerous?" Morgans grinned with predatory satisfaction. "Because this time, he has people who love him instead of people who merely follow him. And love, my dear archaeologist, is the most dangerous force in any sea." The reaction was immediate and global. Within 24 hours of the newspaper's distribution, the world had effectively split into two camps. Pirates, revolutionaries, and oppressed peoples everywhere hailed Luffy as a symbol of hope, someone who could finally challenge the world government's stranglehold on truth. But marine bases went into lockdown, government facilities increased security, and celestial dragons reportedly locked themselves in their palaces out of sheer terror. The crew watched the chaos unfold through reports that poured in from their various contacts. Some reactions were expected, Shanks reportedly laughing with delight while his crew drank toasts to the most interesting development in decades. Others were surprising former enemies like Smoker and Tashigi publicly questioning orders to arrest the Straw Hats, citing concerns about the true nature of justice. But it was the personal message that arrived 3 days later that truly drove home the magnitude of what was happening. The Den Den Mushi's ring was different, not the usual cheerful trill, but something more serious, more urgent. When Luffy answered, the voice that came through was one he'd been expecting but still wasn't prepared to hear. "Hello, son." Dragon's voice carried the weight of years of separation and the gravity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "I imagine you have questions." "A few," Luffy admitted, settling back against the ship's railing. His crew had given him space, but he could feel their presence nearby, offering silent support. The Revolutionary Army has been aware of the potential for D-Clan reincarnation for some time, Dragon began without preamble. Ancient texts, old legends, scattered reports throughout history, but we never expected it to manifest so dramatically. "Did you know about rocks, about what really happened at God Valley?" There was a long pause before Dragon answered. "Some of it, enough to know that the history books are lying, that the world government's version of events is propaganda designed to hide their crimes." Another pause. "What I didn't know was the full scope of what Rocks discovered about the Void Century, about the true nature of the ancient weapons, about the world government's systematic genocide. But now you do. Now I do. And it changes everything." Luffy could hear the weight of decision in his father's voice. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that the Revolutionary Army has been fighting the symptoms instead of the disease. We've been trying to overthrow individual corrupt governments when we should have been exposing the source of the corruption itself." Dragon's voice grew stronger, more determined. "I'm thinking that maybe it's time for the father and son to work together for once. You want to coordinate our efforts. I want to avoid the mistakes that led to Rock's downfall. He tried to fight the entire world government alone, with only his pirate crews for support. But what if this time was different? What if the pirates, the revolutionaries, and every oppressed people in the world stood together?" The idea was staggering in its implications. Not just a pirate crew taking on the government, but a global coalition united by shared purpose and mutual support. "That's," Luffy started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his father was suggesting. "Ambitious beyond reason, potentially catastrophic if it fails, exactly the kind of impossible dream that only someone with the D initial would even consider." Dragon's voice carried a hint of humor. "Yes, it's all of those things. But it's also the only way to ensure that the world government can never commit atrocities like God Valley again. What would you need from me? Information. Everything Rocks learned about the world government structure, their secret facilities, their methods of control. And when the time comes for the final confrontation." Dragon paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of absolute commitment. "When the time comes, I want to stand beside my son as we tear down the lies and build something better." Luffy felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude for a father who had finally chosen to be present for the fight that mattered most. "I'd like that," he said simply. After the call ended, Luffy sat in silence for a long time, processing everything his father had said. A global coalition, pirates and revolutionaries working together. The complete exposure of centuries of government lies. It was exactly what Rocks had dreamed of, but executed in a way that honored love over fear, cooperation over domination. Meanwhile, in the deepest chambers of Marigiua, panic had reached levels not seen since the days of Rocks himself. The 5 elders sat in emergency session, their usual composed demeanor cracking under the weight of reports that poured in from around the world. Marines deserting their posts, government officials publicly questioning orders, entire kingdoms declaring their independence rather than remain under world government control. "This is a catastrophe beyond anything we've faced," one of them declared, his hands shaking as he reviewed intelligence reports. "Public support for the world government has dropped to record lows. Pirates are flocking to his banner. Even some of our own agents are beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. It's not just his power," another added grimly. "It's what he represents, hope, the idea that someone can stand against us and actually win." Rocks was dangerous because he was willing to destroy the world to rebuild it, the third elder observed. "But this is worse. This one wants to expose us, to let the world judge our actions. He wants to turn our subjects against us. Which means we can't simply eliminate him like we did Rocks, the fourth concluded. Killing him now would only make him a martyr, proof that we fear the truth he carries. They turned as one to the fifth elder, the oldest among them, whose silence had grown more ominous with each passing report. You fought him before, the first elder said quietly. At God Valley, you faced Rocks Xebec in single combat and lived to tell about it. What do we do? The ancient figure raised his head, revealing eyes that held the weight of centuries and knowledge that predated the current world government. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had shaped history through personal action. We do what we should have done 40 years ago, he said with quiet finality. We eliminate not just the man, but everyone who might carry on his legacy, his crew, his allies, anyone who has heard his message and might spread it further. That could mean thousands of people. Then thousands of people die. The elder's expression was carved from stone. The alternative is the complete collapse of the world order we have spent centuries building. He stood slowly, his aged frame carrying itself with the bearing of someone who had once been a warrior of legendary skill. I will handle Monkey D. Luffy personally. See to it that assets are positioned to eliminate his known associates, the Revolutionary Army, any former Rocks pirates who might rally to his cause, anyone who might inherit his will if he falls. And if you fail, the elder smiled, and the expression was cold enough to freeze fire. I won't fail. I've had 40 years to prepare for his return. This time there will be no God Valley. No staged battle with convenient survivors. When I'm done, there won't be enough left of Rocks D. Xebec to reincarnate again. As the meeting dissolved and the elders dispersed to implement their various contingency plans, the ancient warrior remained behind, staring at intelligence photos of the Straw Hat Pirates. His attention lingered longest on the image of their captain, so young, so confident, so blissfully unaware of the forces moving against him. Hello again, Rocks, he whispered to the photograph. I've been waiting a long time for this rematch. In his private chambers, he began to prepare equipment that hadn't seen use in decades, weapons that had been forged specifically to kill the unkillable, techniques that had been developed through the study of D-clan physiology and psychology. 40 years ago, he had helped orchestrate Rock's death through superior numbers and careful strategy. This time, he would face the reincarnated captain alone, with the full knowledge of everything that made him dangerous. And this time, he would make sure there was no coming back. Back on the Thousand Sunny, unaware of the forces mobilizing against them, the Straw Hat Pirates dealt with their new status as the most wanted crew in history in characteristically diverse ways. Nami had commandeered the ship's communication center, fielding offers of alliance from pirate crews across the Grand Line. We've got 17 different captains wanting to join our fleet, she reported, including some pretty heavy hitters from the New World. What did you tell them? Luffy asked. That will consider formal alliances after we've had a chance to evaluate their goals and methods. We can't just accept anyone who shows up with a Jolly Roger and good intentions. Robin had immersed herself in analysis, cross-referencing Rock's memories with her own historical knowledge to create a comprehensive map of world government facilities and secret operations. There are research sites that have been operating in secret for centuries, she reported. Places where they've been conducting experiments on D-clan genetics, studying ancient weapons, developing weapons specifically designed to kill devil fruit users. We'll hit them all, Luffy said with quiet determination. Every secret facility, every cover-up, every lie they've built their power on. The world deserves to know the truth. But it was Jinbei who voiced what everyone was thinking. They won't let us simply sail around exposing their secrets, he said during one of their evening planning sessions. The world government's response to Rocks was to mobilize every asset they had, including forces they'd rather keep secret. We should expect the same treatment. Let them come, Zoro said with anticipation. I'm curious to see what the government considers their strongest assets. Be careful what you wish for, Jinbei warned. There are rumors about agents from the Void Century itself, warriors who have been kept alive through unnatural means specifically to deal with threats like this. Luffy nodded, his expression serious. I can feel something moving. Something old and dangerous and very, very angry. He looked around at his crew, his family, with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with deep concern. They're going to come at us with everything they have. Things that make admirals look like training partners. Then we'll face them together, Robin said simply. That's what family does. As the sun set over the Grand Line, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Straw Hat Pirates prepared for what might be their greatest challenge yet. The world knew who they were now, knew what they represented, knew the truth they carried. Some would rally to their cause, offering support and alliance in the fight against oppression. Others would hunt them with the desperation of people whose entire worldview depended on keeping certain secrets buried. But whatever came next, they would face it the way they always had together, united by bonds that transcended blood, nationality, or even death itself. The cycle was accelerating now, old powers stirring to meet new threats, and somewhere in the shadows, an ancient enemy prepared for a rematch 40 years in the making. The question wasn't whether the world government would come for them. The question was whether the Straw Hat Pirates would be strong enough to survive what was coming, and whether love would truly prove stronger than the darkest secrets of the Void Century itself. The attack came at dawn, when the sea was painted gold by the rising sun and the world felt peaceful in that quiet way that mornings sometimes did. Which, of course, was exactly when Marshal D. Teach preferred to strike. The saber of Xebec emerged from the darkness like something dredged up from the ocean's deepest nightmares. The ship was massive, easily 3 times the size of the Thousand Sunny, its black sails bearing the skull and crossbones that had terrorized the seas for years. But there was something different about it now, modifications that spoke of obsession, additions that suggested its captain had been preparing for this specific encounter. Zehahaha. There he is, Blackbeard's voice boomed across the water, carrying that particular brand of malicious glee that made people's skin crawl. The man I've been hunting for so very, very long. Luffy stood at the Sunny's bow, his expression grim as he watched the larger ship approach. He could feel it now, the wrongness that radiated from Teach like heat from a fever. The man who had killed Thatch, captured Ace, betrayed everything the Whitebeard pirates stood for. But underneath all that familiar evil, there was something else. Something that made Rock's memories recoil in disgust. He's different, Luffy said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching ship. Different how? Zoro asked, his hand already on his sword, desperate. Obsessed, Luffy's voice carried knowledge that came from borrowed nightmares. He's been looking for me, not Luffy me, Rocks. The implications of that statement hit the crew like a physical blow. If Blackbeard had been actively hunting for Rock's reincarnation, it meant this wasn't a chance encounter. It meant he'd been planning this confrontation for who knew how long. What does he want? Nami asked, though her tone suggested she really didn't want to know the answer. Everything, Luffy replied with certainty that came from 40 years of understanding people like Teach. Power, knowledge, the secrets of the D clan. He thinks if he can take what I am, steal what I've become, he can claim Rock's legacy for himself. The saber of Xebec pulled alongside the Sunny with predatory precision, its crew arrayed on deck like an army preparing for war. But Luffy's attention was fixed entirely on the figure standing at their bow, Marshal D. Teach, the man who carried the same initial as him but had twisted everything it represented into something monstrous. Monkey D. Luffy, Blackbeard called out, his grin wide enough to split his face. Or should I call you by your real name, the name you've been hiding from the world for so long? I haven't been hiding anything, Luffy replied evenly. I am who I am. Zehahaha, yes you are. You're Rox D. Xebec, the greatest pirate who ever lived, reborn in the body of some rubber brat. Blackbeard's eyes gleamed with a hunger that went beyond mere greed. Do you have any idea how long I've been searching for you? How many years I've spent studying the D clan, learning about reincarnation, preparing for this moment? Too long, apparently. You've gone completely insane. Insane? Blackbeard's laughter was like broken glass. I'm the sanest person in these seas. I'm the only one who understood what Rocks really represented: unlimited ambition, the will to take everything the world has to offer. He gestured grandly, his arms spread wide as if to embrace the entire ocean. You were supposed to be eternal, unchanging, the perfect example of what someone with the D initial could become if they stopped caring about weakness and sentiment. And instead you found me, Luffy said quietly. Instead I found this, Blackbeard's voice dripped with disgust. A man with the power of the most dangerous pirate in history, surrounded by weaklings, talking about friendship and love and all the pathetic things that made the old generation soft. He leaped across the gap between ships with surprising agility for someone his size, landing on the Sunny's deck with enough force to crack the boards. The Straw Hats immediately moved to defensive positions, but Luffy held up a hand. This is between us, Teach. Oh no, Straw Hat, Blackbeard grinned, dark energy beginning to swirl around his hands. This is between Rocks D. Xebec and the man who's going to steal everything that made him great. The darkness fruit activated with a sound like reality tearing. Black holes opened in the air around them, pulling in light and hope and leaving only endless void. But this wasn't just Teach's usual technique, there was something more sophisticated about it, patterns of application that spoke of years of study and preparation. Impressive, Luffy admitted, his body beginning to darken with armament hockey. You've been practicing. I've been preparing. Blackbeard lunged forward, his fist crackling with dark energy. Preparing for the day I could finally claim what should have been mine from the beginning. The punch that followed carried the weight of 2 devil fruits and decades of accumulated hatred. When Luffy caught it on his forearm, the impact sent shockwaves across the water that made both ships groan in protest. Zehahaha, yes, that's the power I remember. Blackbeard pressed his attack, dark energy flowing around them like a living thing. But you're holding back, you're still pretending to be that weak-willed brat instead of embracing what you really are. I'm exactly what I choose to be, Luffy replied, launching a counterattack that combined his gear second speed with hockey techniques from a previous generation. But Blackbeard was ready for it. His darkness fruit absorbed the impact, dissipating the force across multiple dimensions. You think you can beat me with those outdated techniques? I've studied every battle Rox ever fought. I know every technique he ever used. Do you? Luffy's expression grew serious as he activated Gear 4th, his body inflating and hardening with advanced armament hockey. Then you should know that Rock's greatest strength wasn't his techniques, it was his understanding of what he was fighting for. Zehahaha, fighting for, he was fighting for power. For the right to rule the world. He was fighting to expose the truth about the world government, to free people from a system built on lies and oppression. Luffy's fist began to glow with energy that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his devil fruit power. Something you've never understood because you've never cared about anyone but yourself. Caring is weakness, sentiment is failure. Blackbeard's other hand began to glow with the power of the tremor fruit, reality warping around his fingers. The strong take what they want and the weak suffer for it. That's the only truth that matters. The earthquake that followed split the ocean itself, massive waves rolling out from the point of impact. But Luffy was already moving, his enhanced speed carrying him clear of the devastating attack. Gum Gum King Kong Gun, the massive fist that emerged from his transformation, was different from anything his crew had seen before. It carried not just his current power, but techniques refined over decades of combat, hockey applications that belonged to a previous age, and something else, a sense of purpose that transformed raw strength into something approaching art. Blackbeard met it with both devil fruits at once, darkness and seismic force combining into something that should have been able to shatter islands. The collision of their attacks created a dome of pure force that sent both ships skidding backward across the water. Impossible, Blackbeard gasped as the energy cleared, revealing Luffy still standing, still fighting, still refusing to give ground. I have 2 devil fruits. I have the power of legends. How are you matching me? Because power isn't just about what you can take, Luffy replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction. It's about what you're willing to give. Around them, the battle had expanded. The Blackbeard pirates were engaging the Straw Hats in individual duels, but something was different. The Straw Hats fought with a coordination that went beyond mere teamwork. They moved like parts of a single organism, each fighter covering the other's weaknesses, creating combinations that were greater than the sum of their parts. This is what you never understood about Rox, Luffy continued as they circled each other like predators. He wasn't great because he was strong, he was great because people chose to follow him. Because he gave them something to believe in beyond just survival. Pretty words, Blackbeard snarled, launching himself forward again, but words don't win battles. Power does, you're right, Luffy admitted, dodging a devastating punch that would have taken his head off. Power does win battles, but there's more than one kind of power. He gestured, and his crew responded instantly. Not because they feared him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Zoro's sword techniques created openings that Sanji exploited with precision kicks. Robin's arms sprouted from unexpected angles to deflect attacks meant for other crew members. Frankie's laser beams provided covering fire, while Usopp's sniping kept the enemy's heavy hitters off balance. You see that? Luffy asked as he launched another attack, this one enhanced by the knowledge that his friends were watching his back. That's the power Rox really had, not the ability to dominate, but the ability to inspire. Not the strength to break things, but the strength to protect them. Blackbeard's expression shifted from confidence to something approaching panic as he realized what was happening. The battle wasn't going the way he'd planned. Despite having superior numbers, despite his 2 devil fruits, despite years of preparation, he was losing. No, he roared, dark energy exploding outward in all directions. I am the heir to Rock's legacy. I am the one who understood his true nature. You're everything he was afraid of becoming, Luffy interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Power without purpose, strength without compassion, ambition without limits or conscience. The words hit Blackbeard harder than any physical blow. For just a moment his attacks faltered, confusion flickering across his features. That's not. He was the strongest, the most feared. He took what he wanted. He was a man who made mistakes and learned from them too late, Luffy replied, his own attacks never slowing. But at least he learned. At least he regretted the choices that led him down the wrong path. You've never regretted anything in your life, have you? It was true, and they both knew it. Blackbeard had betrayed friends, murdered family, caused countless deaths, and never once felt genuine remorse for any of it. He was what Rox could have become if he'd never cared about anyone but himself. So what? Blackbeard snarled, but there was desperation in his voice now. Regret is weakness, conscience is failure. The strong do what they must. The strong protect what they love, Luffy countered, his fist beginning to glow with energy that seemed to come from his very soul. And I love this crew, I love this world. I love the dream of making things better instead of just making them mine. The punch that followed wasn't just a physical attack. It was a manifestation of everything Luffy represented: hope over despair, love over hate, the choice to build rather than destroy. When it connected with Blackbeard's guard, the impact created patterns of force that looked almost like flowers blooming in midair. Blackbeard staggered backward, his dark energy flickering and failing for the first time since the battle began. Impossible, he whispered. That technique, that's not something Rox ever used. No, Luffy agreed, following up with a combination that mixed his current abilities with ancient wisdom, creating something entirely new. It's something I learned from him, the knowledge of what happens when power serves love instead of the other way around. The battle's conclusion was swift and decisive. Blackbeard, for all his preparation and stolen power, had never understood the fundamental truth about strength, that it was multiplied by the bonds you chose to forge, not the enemies you chose to conquer. When the final blow landed, sending the self-proclaimed heir to Rock's legacy crashing into the mast of his own ship, the silence that followed was profound. Blackbeard struggled to his feet, dark energy flickering weakly around his battered form. "This isn't over," he gasped. "I'll find another way. I'll take what you are, steal what you've become." "No, you won't," Luffy said quietly, "because you still don't understand what makes someone worthy of carrying the D initial. It's not about taking what you want, it's about giving what others need." He turned away from his defeated enemy, addressing his crew with an expression of profound gratitude. "Let's go. We've got a world to change." As they sailed away from the wreckage of Blackbeard's ambitions, leaving the would-be successor to Rock's legacy broken and alone on his damaged ship, Luffy felt something settle in his chest. The confrontation had been about more than just defeating an enemy. It had been about proving to himself that he could face the darkness of his past without becoming it. Rox D. Xebec had been many things: powerful, ambitious, tragically flawed. But at his core, he had been someone who cared about people, who wanted to make the world better even if his methods were wrong. Blackbeard had seen only the power and the ambition, missing entirely the heart that had driven everything else. And that blindness had been his downfall. "You all right?" Zoro asked, settling beside his captain at the ship's bow. "Yeah," Luffy replied, watching the horizon where new adventures waited. "I think I finally understand the difference between inheriting someone's will and just copying their techniques. Will comes from the heart, techniques are just tools." Luffy smiled, the expression warm and genuine. Rock's will was to free people from oppression. His techniques were just his way of trying to do that. Blackbeard copied the techniques but never understood the will behind them. And I understand both. But more than that, I understand that I get to choose how to use what I've inherited. I don't have to repeat his mistakes or follow his exact path. I can take his knowledge and his purpose and find my own way to achieve what he couldn't. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the sea in shades of blue and gold, the Straw Hat Pirates sailed on toward whatever challenges awaited them. Behind them, Blackbeard's obsession lay in ruins, while ahead of them, the promise of real change grew stronger with each passing mile. The cycle was continuing, but it was following a new pattern, now one guided by love instead of hate, hope instead of despair, the choice to build rather than destroy. And somewhere in the depths of his borrowed memories, Rox D. Xebec finally found peace, knowing that his legacy was in hands worthy of carrying it forward. 3 days after defeating Blackbeard, Luffy dreamed of laughter. Not his own laughter or even Rock's bitter amusement at the world's cruelties, but something older and warmer. The kind of laughter that came from genuine joy, from discovering something wonderful in the midst of terrible darkness. It echoed through his sleeping mind like a distant memory of happiness, pulling him deeper into dreams that felt more real than waking. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't on the Thousand Sunny anymore. He stood on an island that existed only in legend now, its massive trees reaching toward a sky that seemed somehow more blue than any he'd ever seen. Laugh Tale, the final island of the Grand Line, the place where Gall D. Roger had found the treasure that made him laugh until he cried. But this wasn't Roger's arrival he was witnessing. This was something much older. So this is what they've been hiding, a voice said beside him, and Luffy turned to see a man who looked remarkably familiar. Dark hair, same build, the kind of carefree expression that belonged to someone who found joy in the simplest things. Joy Boy, the first Joy Boy, not just a title but an actual person. Around them, the ruins of an ancient civilization stretched as far as the eye could see. Not the broken stones and collapsed buildings that archaeologists usually found, but structures that pulsed with life, with purpose, with technology that made the current world look primitive by comparison. They called it the Great Kingdom, Joy Boy continued, his voice heavy with sorrow despite his smile. A place where all races lived together in harmony. Humans, giants, fishmen, sky islanders, even the ones they call monsters now. Everyone had a voice, everyone had value. Luffy found himself walking beside this ancient ancestor, seeing through his eyes, feeling his emotions as if they were his own. What happened to it? He heard himself ask, though the voice that came out was his own, not Joy Boy's. The same thing that always happens when people get too comfortable with equality, came the bitter reply. A small group decided they deserved to rule over everyone else. They called themselves the world government, said they were bringing order to chaos, peace to a violent world. The scene shifted, and suddenly they were standing in the middle of a war zone. Ancient weapons clashed in the sky, not the destructive forces of legend, but something far more sophisticated. Pluton wasn't just a battleship, Luffy realized. It was a mobile city, capable of carrying entire populations to safety. Poseidon wasn't just about controlling sea kings, it was about communication, about bringing all the scattered peoples of the ocean together in harmony. And Uranus? Luffy asked, though he somehow already knew the answer. The power to reshape the world itself, not destroy it, heal it. Bring back islands that had sunk, restore forests that had been burned, undo the damage that war and greed had caused. Joy Boy's expression grew infinitely sad as he watched the battle rage around them. They were tools of creation, not destruction. We built them to help people, to make the world better. But the 20 kingdoms saw only weapons, only threats to their new order. The memory fast-forwarded through centuries of conflict, showing glimpses of the true Void Century, not a mysterious gap in history, but a deliberate erasure. The world government hadn't just won the war, they'd rewritten reality itself, turning symbols of hope into objects of fear. But the will of D survived, Joy Boy said, his voice growing stronger. In every generation, someone carrying that initial would be born with the memories, the purpose, the determination to set things right. Sometimes they'd be pirates, sometimes revolutionaries, sometimes just people who refused to accept injustice. And sometimes, a new voice added, they'd be tyrants who lost sight of the original dream. Luffy turned to see Rox D. Xebec approaching, but not the bitter, hardened man from his other memories. This was Rox as he'd been in the beginning, younger, more idealistic, carrying the same hope that had driven Joy Boy centuries earlier. I remembered too much too fast, Rox admitted, his expression heavy with regret. The rage, the injustice, the sheer scope of what they'd hidden from the world. I wanted to tear it all down, expose every lie, make them pay for every atrocity. But you forgot the most important part, Joy Boy said gently. I forgot that the goal wasn't revenge, it was liberation. Rox looked directly at Luffy, his eyes holding depths of sorrow and hard-won wisdom. I became so focused on fighting the darkness that I forgot to nurture the light. The scene began to shift again, but this time towards something Luffy recognized, the present day, his crew, his friends, his chosen family. But you won't make that mistake, Joy Boy said with absolute certainty. You understand something that took me lifetimes to learn, that real strength comes from the bonds we choose to make, not the enemies we choose to fight. Luffy woke with tears on his cheeks and perfect clarity in his mind. The crew found him sitting at the bow of the ship an hour later, staring at the horizon with an expression they'd learned to associate with world-changing revelations. Another memory? Robin asked gently, settling beside him with 2 cups of coffee. The biggest one yet, Luffy replied, accepting the cup gratefully. I know what the One Piece is now. I know why Roger laughed. I know what the D clan is really supposed to do." The words carried such weight that the rest of the crew gradually gathered around him, drawn by the gravity in his voice. "The ancient weapons," he began without preamble, "they're not weapons at all. They're tools of creation, of healing, of bringing the world back together the way it was before the world government tore it apart." "That's impossible," Nami protested. "Pluton is supposed to be capable of destroying entire islands. Because that's what the government wants people to believe. They took symbols of hope and turned them into objects of fear." Luffy's voice carried absolute conviction. "The real Pluton is a mobile city, designed to evacuate entire populations and give them new homes. Poseidon isn't about controlling sea kings, it's about communication, about bringing all the peoples of the ocean together in harmony." "And Uranus?" Jinbei asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "The power to heal the world, to restore islands that have been destroyed, bring back ecosystems that have been ruined, undo the damage that centuries of war and exploitation have caused." The implications of this revelation hit them like a tsunami. If the ancient weapons were tools of restoration rather than destruction, it meant everything they'd been taught about the world's history was a lie. "But why hide that?" Chopper asked in confusion. "Why wouldn't they want people to know about tools that could help everyone?" "Because tools that could help everyone would make their control unnecessary," Robin said quietly, her historian's mind already working through the implications. "A world where people could communicate freely, travel safely, and heal their damaged lands would be a world that didn't need the world government's protection." "Exactly." Luffy stood, his expression more serious than they'd ever seen it. "The Void Century wasn't just a war, it was the destruction of paradise. The world government didn't just defeat the Great Kingdom, they erased the very concept of a world where everyone could live in harmony." He turned to face his crew directly, his eyes holding depths of knowledge and purpose that belonged to someone far older than his 19 years. "The D-Clan exists to remember what the world was like before they broke it. We're not the natural enemies of the gods because we're violent or destructive. We're their enemies because we remember what they stole, and we refuse to let them keep it stolen." "And the One Piece?" Usopp asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is proof," Luffy said simply. "Roger found evidence of what the world used to be like, documentation of the real history they've been hiding. That's why he laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so beautiful and so tragic at the same time. He saw what we'd lost, and he saw the possibility of getting it back. But he didn't do anything about it," Zoro observed. "He couldn't, he was dying, and he knew the world wasn't ready yet. So he started the Great Pirate Age, hoping that eventually, someone would come along who could finish what Joy Boy started." Luffy's voice grew stronger, more determined. "Someone who had the power to fight, the knowledge to understand, and the heart to choose building over destroying." The silence that followed was profound as each crew member processed what they'd just learned. They weren't just pirates seeking adventure anymore. They were inheritors of an ancient legacy, carriers of a dream that had been passed down through generations of people who refused to accept injustice. "So what do we do now?" Frankie asked finally. "How do we restore a paradise that was destroyed centuries ago? First, we get to laugh tail and claim the evidence Roger left behind. Then we use it to expose the truth about the world government's lies." Luffy's expression hardened. "And then we find the real ancient weapons and use them for what they were actually designed for, healing the world instead of ruling it." "That sounds like a declaration of war against the entire established order," Sanji observed, lighting a cigarette with hands that weren't quite steady. "It is." Luffy looked around at his crew, his family, with an expression of profound gratitude and deep concern. "I won't lie to you, this isn't just about becoming Pirate King anymore. This is about fundamentally changing how the world works. The government will throw everything they have at us. Ancient weapons, secret agents, powers we can't even imagine." "And," Brooke asked cheerfully, "we've faced impossible odds before, yo-ho-ho-ho. This time might be different. This time they might have weapons specifically designed to kill people like me. Technology from the Void Century, techniques developed over centuries of studying the D-Clan." Luffy's voice grew soft, vulnerable. "I need you all to know that if you want to leave, if you want to find safer dreams to chase, I'll understand. This isn't your burden to carry." The response was immediate and unanimous. "Like hell," Zoro said firmly. "You're our captain. Where you go, we go." "Besides," Nami added with a grin that was only slightly forced, "someone needs to make sure you don't accidentally destroy the world while you're trying to save it. And think of the historical significance." Robin's eyes were shining with scholarly excitement. "We have the chance to witness the restoration of the true history, to see paradise rebuilt with our own eyes." One by one, each crew member reaffirmed their loyalty, their commitment to seeing this impossible dream through to the end. Even knowing the dangers, even understanding the magnitude of what they were attempting, they chose to stand together. "You guys are crazy," Luffy said, but his voice was thick with emotion. Says the reincarnated ancient pirate who's planning to overthrow the world government and restore a lost paradise, Usopp pointed out. "We're just along for the ride." As the day wore on and they sailed toward their next destination, Luffy found himself thinking about the dream he'd experienced. The weight of inherited purpose that had once felt crushing now seemed manageable, shared as it was among people who had chosen to carry it with him. Joy Boy had failed because he'd tried to preserve paradise in a world that wasn't ready for it. Rocks had failed because he'd tried to force change through fear and violence. But maybe, just maybe, Monkey D. Luffy could succeed by choosing a different path entirely. Not preservation or destruction, but restoration. Not force or fear, but hope and determination. Not ruling the world, but healing it and giving it back to the people who deserve to live free. It was an impossible dream, the kind that only someone with the D initial would even consider attempting. But as Luffy looked around at his crew, at the people who had chosen to follow him not because they had to, but because they wanted to, he felt something that neither Joy Boy nor Rocks had possessed in their final moments. Confidence, not in his own power, but in the power of the bonds they'd forged together. The cycle was reaching its culmination, ancient secrets were finally being revealed, and somewhere ahead of them, the final island of the Grand Line waited with the keys to changing everything. The question wasn't whether they would reach Laugh Tale. The question was whether the world would be ready for what they found there, and whether love truly would prove stronger than the darkness that had ruled for 800 years. But looking at his crew, at his family, at the people who had stood by him through every impossible challenge, Luffy found himself smiling. They were about to find out. Laugh Tale appeared on the horizon like a dream made manifest, an island that seemed to exist slightly outside of reality itself, its shores shimmering with an otherworldly light that made the very air around it feel electric with possibility. "There it is," Robin breathed, lowering her spyglass with hands that trembled slightly. "The final island, the place where it all began, and where it all ends." The Thousand Sunny approached slowly, as if the island itself was drawing them forward with invisible currents. As they drew closer, Luffy could feel something awakening in his mind, not new memories this time, but a resonance, like two tuning forks struck at the same frequency. "It knows we're here," he said quietly, his voice carrying wonder and certainty in equal measure. "What knows?" Chopper asked nervously. "The message, Joy Boy's final message. It's been waiting for someone like me to come and hear it." They made landfall on a beach of golden sand that felt warm beneath their feet despite the cool ocean breeze. The island was alive in a way that defied explanation, not just with plants and animals, but with something deeper. An awareness that seemed to permeate every grain of sand, every blade of grass, every molecule of air they breathed. The trees, Sanji observed, staring up at massive trunks that twisted toward the sky in impossible spirals. There, moving, he wasn't wrong. The ancient trees swayed without any wind, their branches forming patterns that looked almost like written language. And as the crew watched in amazement, a path began to form through the forest, not carved or built, but simply appearing as the living island itself rearranged to welcome them. "It's guiding us," Jinbei said with the kind of awe usually reserved for natural disasters or divine miracles. They followed the path deeper into the island's heart, past wonders that belonged to no current age. Flowers that sang in harmonies that touched the soul. Streams that flowed uphill toward pools of water so clear they seemed like windows into other worlds. Animals that watched them pass with intelligence that suggested they understood exactly who these visitors were and why they had come. At the island's center, they found it, a massive tree that dwarfed even the giants of Elbaf, its trunk so wide that the crew couldn't see around its curve. And carved into its bark, worn smooth by centuries but still clearly visible, was a message in the ancient language that only Robin could read. "To the one who carries my will," she translated, her voice barely above a whisper. "To the heir of the D who comes not with conquest but with compassion, not with hatred but with hope. Welcome, my successor. Welcome to the truth." As she finished reading, the tree began to change. The bark shifted and flowed like liquid, revealing an opening large enough for them all to enter. Beyond the threshold lay not the hollow interior they might have expected, but something impossible, a chamber that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions, its walls lined with crystalline structures that pulsed with soft, warm light. And in the center of that impossible space sat the One Piece. Not treasure in any conventional sense, but something far more valuable, a perfect sphere of some unknown material that contained within it the entire history of the world. Not the sanitized version taught in schools or recorded in official documents, but the real history. The truth about the Great Kingdom, the Void Century, the lies that had shaped civilization for 800 years. "My God," Robin gasped, her archaeological instincts overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were seeing. "It's all here, everything they tried to erase, everything they tried to hide." But Luffy barely heard her. His attention was fixed on a figure that had materialized beside the sphere, translucent, shimmering, but unmistakably real. Joy Boy himself, preserved somehow in this place outside of time, waiting for the successor who would finally be worthy of his legacy. "Hello, Rocks," Joy Boy said with a smile that held 8 centuries of patient waiting. "Or should I say, hello, Luffy, you've done something I never managed, you've learned to be both without losing either." "Joy Boy," Luffy's voice held depths of emotion he couldn't even name. "You've been waiting here all this time, waiting and watching, seeing each generation of D-Clan members struggle with the weight of inherited purpose, watching some succeed and others fail." The ancient figure's expression grew infinitely sad. "Watching you struggle most of all, my distant heir, the burden you've carried has been heavier than any before you. Because I was both of you," Luffy realized. Joy Boy's hope and Rock's rage combined in one person. "Exactly. And the question that brought you here, the choice that will define everything that comes next, is this: which will you choose to be?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Around them, the crystalline chamber pulsed with the heartbeat of history itself, while Luffy's crew watched with the kind of tension that preceded either triumph or tragedy. "I choose to be me," Luffy said finally, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Monkey D. Luffy, who happens to remember being other people. I won't deny Joy Boy's hope or ignore Rock's knowledge, but I won't be defined by either of them." Joy Boy's smile could have powered the sun. "Perfect answer. And what will you do with the knowledge contained here? How will you use the truth they've tried so hard to hide?" "I'll give it back to the world, not through conquest or destruction, but through proof. Through showing people what's possible when we choose cooperation over domination, healing over hurting." Luffy looked around at his crew, drawing strength from their presence. "I'll restore the ancient weapons to their true purpose and use them to heal the damage centuries of lies have caused. And the world government, the celestial dragons, the system that has oppressed the world for 800 years, I'll give them the same choice I give everyone: change or be changed. Cooperate with the restoration or be swept aside by it." Luffy's expression hardened with resolve that belonged to both of his previous incarnations. "But I won't rule through fear, and I won't sacrifice innocent people for the greater good. The world doesn't need another tyrant, even a benevolent one." "Then you truly have learned what took me lifetimes to understand," Joy Boy said, his form beginning to fade as his purpose was finally fulfilled. "The strongest power isn't the ability to force your will on others, it's the ability to inspire them to choose your vision for themselves." As the ancient figure dissolved into points of light that merged with the crystalline walls, the One Piece itself began to change. The sphere opened like a flower, revealing not physical treasure but something infinitely more valuable: complete knowledge of the world's true history, the locations of the real ancient weapons, and detailed plans for the kind of paradise the Great Kingdom had once been. But more than that, it contained something else, a final gift from Joy Boy to his successor. The power to hear the voice of all things, Robin read from symbols that had appeared on the chamber walls. Not just the ability to understand ancient texts or communicate with sea kings, but the capacity to hear the will of the world itself, to understand what the planet needs to heal. Luffy felt it as she spoke, a new sense opening in his mind like a flower blooming in sunlight. Suddenly, he could hear everything: the song of the ocean as it called for cleaner waters, the whispered pain of islands scarred by war and exploitation, the desperate hope of countless people who dreamed of a world where they could live free from fear. "I can hear them," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "All of them, everyone who's suffering, everyone who's hoping, everyone who's waiting for someone to make things better." "And what do they want?" Nami asked gently. "The same thing we all want, the same thing Joy Boy wanted, and Rox wanted, and Roger wanted." Luffy wiped his eyes and turned to face his crew with an expression of perfect clarity. "They want to be free. Free to love who they choose, live where they want, dream impossible dreams and maybe make them come true." He gestured to the knowledge surrounding them, the crystalline records of everything the world government had tried to erase. "This is how we do it, not by conquering the world but by giving it back to the people who live in it." not by ruling from the top, but by supporting from the bottom. Not by being the strongest, but by helping others become strong too. That's going to be the most dangerous revolution in history, Zoro observed with something approaching approval. A revolution that makes people free instead of just changing who's in charge. Good thing we've got practice dealing with dangerous situations, Sanji added, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. One by one, his crew stepped forward to examine the treasures around them, not gold or jewels, but knowledge and possibility and the keys to healing a broken world. Each found something that spoke to their own dreams and ambitions, their own hopes for what the future could hold. Robin discovered historical texts that would let her finally complete the true story of the Void Century. Nami found navigational charts that showed not just where islands were, but where new ones could be created to give displaced peoples homes. Chopper uncovered medical knowledge that could cure diseases that had plagued the world for centuries. Each crew member found their part in the greater dream, their role in the paradise they would build together. So, Brooks said cheerfully, examining what appeared to be musical notation that could literally harmonize the world, when do we start this impossible revolution? Yo-ho-ho-ho, we already have, Luffy replied, absorbing the last of Joy Boy's legacy into his mind and soul. The moment we chose to stand together instead of apart, the moment we decided that love was stronger than fear, the moment we proved that people could change the world without losing themselves. He looked around the crystalline chamber one last time, memorizing every detail of this place where truth lived. When they left here, the real work would begin, not just finding the ancient weapons, but convincing a broken world that healing was possible, that paradise could be restored, that 800 years of lies could finally come to an end. Are you ready? He asked his crew, his family, his chosen bonds that had proven stronger than death itself. We've been ready since the day we met you, Robin said simply, speaking for all of them. As they emerged from the heart of Laugh Tale, the island itself seemed to sigh with satisfaction, its ancient duty finally complete. The path back to their ship was shorter than the one that had led them in, as if the living island was eager to send them on their way to fulfill their destiny. Standing on the beach where they had first landed, Luffy took one final look at the place where his journey as both himself and his past incarnations had finally been completed. I am Monkey D. Luffy, he declared to the sea and sky and anyone who might be listening. Captain of the Straw Hat Pirates, inheritor of Joy Boy's dream, bearer of Rox D. Xebec's memories, and the man who's going to give the world back its paradise. The declaration carried across the water with the force of conqueror's hockey, but not the kind meant to dominate. This was something else entirely, a promise, a commitment, a covenant with the future that would reshape everything that came after. As the Thousand Sunny sailed away from Laugh Tale, carrying within it knowledge that could topple governments and restore worlds, the crew found themselves quieter than usual. Not from doubt or fear, but from the simple magnitude of what they had committed themselves to achieving. So, Usopp said finally, his voice carrying the kind of forced casualness that preceded either celebration or panic, we're really going to take on the entire world government. All of them at once. Eventually, Luffy agreed cheerfully, already focused on the horizon ahead. But first, we find the real ancient weapons. Then we gather allies, pirates, revolutionaries, ordinary people who are tired of being oppressed. Then we show the world what paradise looks like. And then, Jinbei asked. Then we give everyone the choice, Luffy said with a smile that held equal parts compassion and steel. Join us in building something better, or get out of the way while we do it anyway. The cycle that had begun with Joy Boy's dream and continued through Rock's rage was finally reaching its intended conclusion. Not with conquest or domination, but with restoration and hope. Not with a single man ruling the world, but with the world learning to rule itself. It was the most impossible dream anyone had ever attempted. And as the Straw Hat Pirates sailed into the sunset, their ship loaded with the keys to paradise and their hearts full of unshakable determination, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The revolution wouldn't be televised, broadcasted, or announced with fanfare. It would be lived, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one island at a time, until the entire world remembered what it had lost and decided to take it back. Behind them, Laugh Tale shimmered and faded back into legend, its purpose finally fulfilled. Ahead of them, the Grand Line stretched endlessly, full of allies to be found, enemies to be faced, and a paradise to be rebuilt from the ashes of 8 centuries of lies. Monkey D. Luffy, who remembered being Joy Boy and Rox D. Xebec but chose to remain himself, stood at the bow of his ship and smiled at the future. The cycle was finally complete. The real story was just beginning. And this time, love would win. Man, what a ride! Watching Luffy go from confused nightmares to fully embracing both sides of his identity while never losing that core goodness that makes him, well, him. The way he chose love over fear, building over destroying, that's pure Luffy right there, just with the wisdom of ages backing him up. Hit like if this got you hyped, and tell me your favorite scene in the comments. Was it Big Mom's emotional breakdown, or maybe that final showdown with his own dark legacy? Subscribe for more crazy One Piece theories, and definitely drop suggestions for what impossible scenario we should tackle next. Catch you later, and remember, inherited will is only as strong as the heart that carries it. Peace.